The sky over Wild Mesa turned the color of a fresh bruise, a sickly yellow-green that promised violence. Jace Redhawk stood on the edge of the cliff, his black hair catching the electric wind. He was a tall man, built with the long, hard muscle of a warrior, which he had been. He was perhaps 28, maybe 29 years old. Time moved differently for him, marked by seasons and battles rather than calendars. A thin white scar cut from his left temple to his jaw, a relic of a fight he had won but not forgotten. He watched the wall of brown dust approach, rolling across the valley floor. It was not a storm. It was an invasion. It would scour the land clean, peel paint from wood, and drive grit into the marrow of a man's bones. He turned from the edge, not running, but moving with a predator's economy of motion. His cabin stood behind him, solid timber set against the rock face, a fortress of his own making. Beyond it, the corral and the stable that held his true wealth. He heard the horses before he saw their panic, a high-pitched scream from his best mare, a sound of pure terror that cut through the rising howl of the wind. The first gust hit the cabin like a solid fist. Grit stung his exposed face. He pulled his bandana up over his nose, his eyes narrowing. The stable was his first priority. He moved toward it, the world vanishing into a howling, opaque brown fog. He tasted the alkaline grit on his tongue. The heavy stable doors were rattling in their frames, the wood screaming in protest. He reached them just as the full force of the storm hit the structure. The timbers groaned, a deep, resonant sound of wood straining to its breaking point. Inside, it was chaos. 6 horses, the finest breeding stock he supplied to the army for a price that would make a senator blush, were rearing and kicking in their stalls. Their eyes were white discs of terror. "Easy," he said. His voice was low, almost a vibration, felt more than heard. It was the voice he used for spooked horses and for men who were about to die. A sound like a cannon shot cracked directly above him, the main support beam. He looked up and saw the roof lift, just slightly, as if the wind were taking a breath. Then it dropped. Splinters and dust rained down. He did not think. He reacted. He moved to the nearest stall, throwing the bolt. He grabbed the mare by the halter, striking her hard on the flank with his open palm. The sharp, stinging shock of the blow cut through her panic for a single second. It was all he needed. He shoved her toward the wide doors he had kicked open. 1. He dodged a kick from the stallion in the next stall, the hoof missing his chest by an inch. He did not bother with the latch. He vaulted onto the animal's back, bareback, his thighs gripping the horse's trembling body. He wrapped one hand in the coarse mane. He used his legs, the constant iron pressure of a true Comanche rider, guiding the panicked animal through the splintering doorway just as a 10-foot section of the roof collapsed where the horse had been standing only seconds before. 2. He spent the next 10 minutes fighting the wind, the collapsing structure, and the blind terror of the animals. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence, a warrior again. He got them all out, herding them not into the corral, which would offer no protection, but into the lee of the cliff face, a shallow alcove in the rock where they huddled together, trembling and snorting. When the wind finally died down, hours later, the world was remade in shades of brown and silence. Jace leaned against the rock, breathing hard. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. He was bruised from flying debris, but the horses were safe. He looked at the stable. It was rubble, a pile of expensive, splintered kindling. He walked to his cabin. The porch, a solid structure he had built with his own hands, had been ripped away. The planks scattered across the mesa. The heavy front door hung from one leather hinge. He pushed the door open. The inside was worse. A thick blanket of fine sand covered everything. It was on his bedroll, in his iron skillet, on the polished wood of his rifle stock. It covered the stacks of paper on his desk, papers that tied him to a world far from this cliff. This cabin was his refuge, his fortress of solitude, built on the high cliff overlooking the wide, grassy valley. It was a magnificent view of a world that did not want him, but inside, it reflected the man. Jace Red Hawk was a contradiction. He was Comanche, born to the Quahati band, a warrior who had counted coup and raids against the Ute and the white settlers. He was also, technically, a millionaire. His name, signed in clear, strong script, was on papers locked in a Santa Fe bank vault, papers that gave him a controlling share in a silver mine that bled wealth from the mountains. His string of horses, bred for endurance and intelligence, were the preferred mount for United States cavalry officers. He moved between two worlds, and he belonged to neither. To the people in Dust Creek, the small, harsh town huddled in the valley below, he was just that wild Indian up on the mesa. They saw the Comanche blood, the scars, the silent way he moved. They did not see the money. They did not know the man who negotiated ironclad contracts in fluent, unaccented English, who could read a balance sheet as easily as he could read a deer track. To his own people, or what was left of them starving on the reservation, he was suspect, a man who wore a white man's linen shirt, who dealt in their paper currency, who lived apart instead of sharing their government-issued misery. They saw him as a man who had perhaps traded his blood right for paper dollars. He was a traitor to some, a ghost to others. So he lived alone, and his cabin showed it. Even before the storm, it had been a place of precise male chaos. A fine Spanish saddle, worth more than most men's homes, was thrown over a chair instead of on its rack. Dirty clothes lay piled near a stack of Winchester rifles. Empty bottles of whiskey gathered dust in a corner, testament to silent, lonely nights where the only sound was the wind. Weaponry, leather, horse tack, maps, and half-eaten meals defined the space. It was the home of a man who needed no one, and perhaps had no one left to need. Jay stood in the doorway and surveyed the damage. The grit was deep, covering the floor in a brown carpet. It would take days to clean. The stable needed a complete rebuild from the ground up. The porch was gone, and in 3 days, he was supposed to drive to Santa Fe. He had a meeting to negotiate a new contract for silver, a contract worth tens of thousands of dollars. He could not do it all. The realization settled on him, heavy and unwelcome as the grit itself. He was a warrior. He was a rancher. He was a businessman. But he was only one man. He could track a man for 100 miles. He could break a wild horse, and he could outthink a banker. But he could not be in 2 places at once, and he could not scrub sand out of his own floor while rebuilding a stable and securing his fortune. He hated the thought of another person in his space. He hated the idea of anyone touching his things, upsetting the precise chaos he lived in. He was fiercely, painfully self-reliant, but the logic was inescapable. He needed help. He needed someone to scrub the sand from the floors, to put the cabin right, to handle the domestic tasks he despised and had ignored for years. He needed a woman. The thought soured in his mouth. The next morning, he rode his least panicked horse down the long, winding switchback trail to Dust Creek. The town stank of stale beer, manure, cheap tobacco, and desperation. It was a raw collection of unpainted wooden storefronts, a place where ranchers with too much land and gun runners with too few morals made the rules. The law was a single, tired marshal who usually looked the other way as long as the bullets did not fly before midnight. Jay swung down from his horse in front of the Buckhorn Saloon, the only place that served as a hotel, post office, and hiring hall. He ignored the stares from the men lounging on the boardwalk. He ignored the way they stopped talking, their hands moving just a little closer to their pistols. Their fear was an old, familiar coat he wore every time he came to town. He went inside. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of whiskey spilled on sawdust. He walked to the public board, a piece of flat pine where notices for lost cattle and wanted men were tacked. He pulled a piece of paper and a pencil stub from his saddlebag. His handwriting was clear, strong, and educated, a fact that would have surprised the men watching him. Need a person to clean the cabin, he wrote. Cash paid every day. Must work up on the mountain. You do not ask about my life. I will not ask about yours." He pushed the tack into the board with his thumb, the small brass head sinking deep into the wood. "Well, looky here," a voice drawled from a dark corner table. A cowboy with a greasy hat and a stained vest spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the floor, missing Jace's boot by inches. "The chief is looking for a maid." His companions at the table laughed, a harsh, braying sound. "Who the hell would work for a redskin?" another added, his voice louder, meant for the whole room. "Does not matter if he has money. It is dirty money, ain't it?" Jace turned slowly. He did not look at them with anger. He looked at them with a flat, cold emptiness that was far more terrifying than any rage. He had killed men for less than that. He had killed men for nothing at all, back when the world was different and his only law was the horse and the lance. But killing them would solve nothing. It would only prove their point, and it would bring the marshal, which was a waste of his time. He held the loud cowboy's gaze until the man nervously looked away, shifting in his chair and finding his drink suddenly fascinating. Jace said nothing. He turned his back on them, a deliberate act of complete contempt, and walked out of the saloon. The silence he left behind was heavier and more potent than any of their insults. But as he mounted his horse, the sting was there, the familiar, dull ache of isolation. He had the white man's money, but he would always have the red man's skin. He was trapped between two worlds, welcome in neither. He rode back up the trail as the sun began to bleed across the western sky. The heavens were painted in streaks of violent red, deep orange, and bruised purple. It was beautiful, and it was lonely. He reached the cabin on the cliff. The door still hung crookedly from its one hinge. He stepped inside. The silence was absolute, broken only by the settling of the wind. The grit crunched under his boots in the fading light. He looked at the mess, the physical proof of his solitude. He was a rich man. He was a warrior. He was a survivor. And he was standing in a cold, empty, broken home. An emptiness settled over him, vast and cold as the high desert night. He did not know it then, but the note he had tacked to that dusty board was not just a request for help. It was a summons, and someone was about to respond. 3 days had passed since the storm. 3 days of Jace Redhawk working from sunup to the last edge of twilight, his muscles aching with the effort of clearing rubble and salvaging timber. He was on the skeleton of the stable roof, high above the ground, his hammer rising and falling in a steady, metallic rhythm. The sound was flat and lonely in the high, clear air. He paused, the hammer heavy in his hand. He had not heard a sound, not the slip of a boot on rock or the snap of a twig. But something was different. A warrior's senses, honed by years of listening for things that did not belong, told him he was no longer alone. His gaze swept the valley, moving past his horses in the temporary rope corral, and settled on the switchback trail. He saw it, a shape, small and dark, moving with a plodding, steady rhythm. It was not an animal. It was a person, on foot. He watched, motionless. The figure was still more than a mile away, deep in the winding part of the trail. He stayed on the roof, watching the figure climb. It was a woman. She was small, but she did not falter on the steep grade. She did not stop to rest or look back. She just kept coming, one foot in front of the other, a tiny speck of determination against the vast red rock. It took her nearly an hour. Jace had climbed down from the roof and was standing by the ruined porch, his arms crossed over his chest. When she finally reached the clearing, she stopped about 10 feet away from him, not out of fear, it seemed, but out of a quiet respect for his space. She was young, maybe 25 years old, maybe 27. Her skin was the color of sun-warmed adobe, her hair a thick, plain black, pulled back tightly into a bun. Though weary wisps escaped to frame her face, she wore a shawl, so faded and thin its original color was a mystery, and a dress patched with so many different fabrics it looked like a map of her poverty. Her shoes were thin leather, worn through at the soles. She held a small, cheap cloth bag. But it was her eyes that held him. They were dark, and they were tired, deeply tired, as if she had not slept well in a year. Yet, inside that exhaustion, there was a core of hard, unyielding resolve. She was not afraid of him. She just looked at him, waiting. She spoke first, her voice steadier than he expected. It was low, with the faintest accent. "I am Elena Morales. I am here for the cleaning work." She did not wait for him to ask. "I am used to hard work. I am not afraid of dirt." Jace studied her. He had expected he did not know. Maybe an older widow from town, someone desperate and broken. Not this young woman who looked like she could be snapped in two by a strong gust of wind, yet whose eyes said she would not. "It is a long walk," he said. It was not a question. "I am used to walking. The work is hard," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the cabin. The storm had caked every surface in filth. "I saw the stable," she replied, her gaze moving to the wreckage. "That is hard work. Cleaning is just cleaning." He felt a need to warn her, to test that resolve. This was his territory, and he did not like intruders. "It is not just the dirt. It is the mountain. The wind does not stop. There are cougars, rattlesnakes. The path is dangerous." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Senor, as long as there is pay, I ask nothing else. The wind and the snakes are my concern, not yours." Jace almost smiled. Almost. The corner of his mouth twitched. He stepped back, pushing the heavy, broken cabin door open wider. "The cabin is first." Elena Morales stepped inside. She paused on the threshold, her eyes taking in the absolute disaster. The thick layer of sand, the overturned furniture, the empty bottles, the general male squalor that existed even before the storm. She did not sigh. She did not wrinkle her nose. She did not complain. She simply set her cloth bag down on the floor, unwrapped her faded shawl, and folded it neatly, placing it on top of the bag. Then she rolled up the sleeves of her patched dress. Jace watched her. Her arms were thin, yes, but they were not weak. They were defined by sinew, the muscles moving smoothly and efficiently under her brown skin as she found his broom in the corner. She attacked the sand first, her movements economical, rhythmic. There was no wasted energy. She moved with a practical grace, her hips shifting as she swept, her body bending and straightening. It was the movement of a woman who knew physical labor as a second language, who knew that the only way to finish a job was to start it. It was both soft and intensely real. A sheen of sweat quickly appeared on her temples and at the nape of her neck. Jace went back outside to work on the stable, the sound of his hammer now punctuated by the scrape and sweep of her broom inside. The domestic sound was foreign, and it set his teeth on edge. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the wood and the nails, but he was acutely aware of her presence. After an hour, his throat was dry. He needed water. He walked back to the cabin, intending to grab the canteen from his table. He stopped in the doorway. She had cleared most of the loose sand and was now on her hands and knees by the hearth, scrubbing at a patch of dried mud and spilled whiskey that had caked onto the floorboards. She was angled away from him. Her hair, which had been in that tight bun, had started to come loose, thick black strands sticking to her damp neck. Her dress was old, thin cotton. The work had made her sweat, and the fabric clung to her. It traced the sharp, clear line of her spine, the delicate shape of her shoulder blades, and the soft, womanly curve of her waist and hip as she put her weight into the scrubbing. She was focused, breathing audibly through her mouth, her arm moving in strong, circular motions with the rag she must have brought in her bag. Jace stood frozen, silent. He felt a sudden, sharp pull deep in his gut. It was a feeling so old, so dormant. He almost did not recognize it. It was pure, simple, physical attraction. It had been years since he had looked at a woman and felt anything other than indifference or suspicion. He felt his blood warm, a tightening low in his belly. He had forgotten what this felt like. He immediately suppressed it, his face hardening. He was a warrior. He was in control. He made a small sound in his throat, shuffling his boot on the gritty floor. Elena startled, scrambling to her feet in one fluid, defensive motion. Her face flushed, a dark red under her tan skin. She wiped a stray piece of hair from her cheek with the back of her wrist, leaving a smudge of dirt across her face. She looked like a cornered animal, ready to bolt. "I need water," Jace said. His voice was flat, cold, indifferent. He strode past her, grabbed the canteen from the table, and walked back out into the blinding sunlight, his heart beating a little faster than it should have. The rest of the day passed in a similar rhythm. He worked outside, lifting beams and sawing wood. She worked inside. The sounds of domesticity, the scraping of a chair being righted, the solid thud of a pelt being beaten clean, the quiet splash of water were a constant, unfamiliar distraction. By late afternoon, the sun was casting long shadows across the mesa. He was tired, his muscles burning. He walked back to the cabin. The change was stark. The thick layer of sand was gone. The floor was scrubbed clean, still damp in places. His pelts were hanging on the walls, not thrown in a corner. His weapons were stacked neatly by the door. His bedroll was aired out and folded at the head of his cot. The stove was black and polished. The windows were clean, letting in the clear, sharp light of the setting sun. His desk was the most telling. It was covered in maps, assay reports, and contracts related to the silver mine. She had obviously been there. The dust was gone, but she had not moved a single document. She had not stacked them. She had cleaned around them. She had not looked at his contracts. She had not asked about the stack of cavalry medals he kept in a tin box. She had kept her word. I asked nothing else. She was wiping down the last window, the setting sun catching the amber flecks in her dark eyes. "I am finished for today," she said. Jace nodded. He went to a small, locked wooden box on his shelf, unlocked it with a key from his pocket, and took out several silver coins. He held them out to her. It was more than a fair day's wage. It was a generous amount, almost double what she might make in town for the same work. Elena looked at the coins in his hand. Her eyes widened. Just for a second, she wiped her hands on her dress, took the money, and did not count it. She did not give him a grateful, feminine smile. She did not say, "Thank you, Senor, you are too kind." She curled her hand around the coins, a fierce, possessive gesture, and shoved her fist deep into the pocket of her dress. The relief that washed over her face was so profound it was almost painful to watch. It was not gratitude. It was survival. Jace felt a sharp spike of curiosity. This woman was not working for new shoes or a pretty ribbon. She was working as if a wolf were at her heels. What, or who, he wondered. Was she running from? What was she racing to feed? He looked out the newly cleaned window. The sun was touching the tops of the far mesas. The sky was turning a pale, metallic copper. In an hour, it would be dark. The trail down was treacherous even in daylight. "It will be dark soon," he said, stating the obvious. "The trail is not safe. You can sleep here, by the fire." He gestured to the main room. It was a practical offer. Elena was already tying her shawl around her head. Her reaction was immediate and absolute. "No." It was not rude. It was non-negotiable. "I must be home," she said, picking up her cloth bag of cleaning tools. "I must be back before it is fully dark." Jace frowned. "I am telling you, the cougars hunt at this hour." "Then I must walk fast," she said. She was already at the door. "I will be back tomorrow, at sunup." She slipped out of the cabin and was gone. She did not look back. Jace stood on the threshold of his ruined porch, watching her. He followed her small, determined figure as she moved quickly down the path, her steps almost a jog. She disappeared and reappeared between the boulders and the juniper trees, a tiny, moving speck against the enormous, silent landscape. He watched until she was completely gone, swallowed by the growing shadows in the valley. He turned and went back inside his cabin. It was clean. It smelled of lye soap and damp wood smoke, and faintly, of her. The scent of her sweat and the dried herbs that seemed to cling to her clothes. It was the first time in years his home had felt like a home, and the first time in years he was not entirely alone in it. He stood in the center of the clean room, a new, unfamiliar feeling stirring inside him. It was a conflict. Jace Red Hawk did not care about people. He did not get involved. He kept his distance. It was how he had survived. But as he stood there, in the copper-colored twilight, he found himself wondering with a sharp, unwelcome intensity. Where was she running to? He found himself caring, and that, he knew, was a far more dangerous thing than any cougar hunting in the dark. A routine established itself over the next few days. It was a rhythm built on hard work and silence. Elena Morales would appear on the trail just as the sun cleared the eastern mesa, her figure small and steady against the growing light. She would work for 10 hours, cleaning, scrubbing, and beginning the monumental task of organizing the chaos inside Jace's cabin. She was relentless. She scrubbed the soot from the stones of the hearth. She beat the dust from his blankets and pelts until her arms must have burned. Jace worked outside, rebuilding the stable. The sounds of his hammer and saw were now matched by the sounds of her work, the scrape of a bucket, the thud of a log being placed by the fire, the quiet, efficient movements of a woman intent on her labor. He tried, a few times, to talk to her. It was not something he was good at. He felt awkward, his words sounding too loud in the quiet space she had created. "The trail was not too wet today?" he asked one morning. "No, senor," she replied, not looking up from the harness she was polishing, a job he had not even asked her to do. "You should let me know if you see any wolves. They have been bold this season." "I see nothing." Her answers were always polite, always brief. She was not unfriendly, but she was a closed door. She was there for the silver coins, and nothing else. Jace, a man who prized his own isolation, found himself frustrated by hers. He was used to people wanting something from him, his money, his land, his protection. She wanted only the pay he had offered. The real puzzle, the thing his warrior mind kept turning over, was the food. At midday, he would stop his work on the stable and sit on a log, pulling out a piece of dried jerky and a thick slice of bread from his stores. The first day, he gestured with the jerky toward her where she sat on the porch step. "I have food," he'd said. She had looked at him with those tired, steady eyes and shaken her head. "No, thank you. I have my own." Jace watched her. He watched her every day after that. She would sit, her back straight, and pull her small cloth bag onto her lap. From it, she would take a piece of hard, dry biscuit. It was never more than that. Sometimes only half a biscuit. She would eat it slowly, taking small, deliberate bites. She would drink water from his well. One day, he watched her break the small biscuit in half. She ate one half, her gaze distant, looking out over the valley. Then she took the other half, wrapped it carefully in the cloth, and tucked it back into her bag. Jace frowned. He looked at the thick slice of bread in his own hand. This woman was doing back-breaking labor. She was thin, her body fueled by almost nothing. Why would she refuse his food, only to save half of the little she had? It was a piece that did not fit. It was an anomaly. And Jace Red Hawk was a man who noticed anomalies. They were the things that kept a man alive in the high country. The question lodged itself in his mind and stayed there, sharp and persistent, like a cactus spine under the skin. The afternoon, perhaps 4 or 5 days after she had started, the weather turned. The high, clear blue of the desert sky vanished, replaced by a low, fast-moving ceiling of clouds the color of dirty iron. A wind picked up, not the warm breath of the valley, but a sharp, cold current from the north peaks. It carried the smell of ice and trouble. Jace stopped his work, tasting the air. This was not a dust storm. This was a cold front, fast and mean. It would bring sleet, maybe even snow, and it would make the trail down the mountain a treacherous sheet of mud and ice. He walked to the cabin. Elena was sweeping the newly rebuilt porch, her small figure leaning against the wind. "Leave it," Jace said, his voice sharp, cutting through the howl of the wind. "A storm is coming, a bad one. You must stay the night." She did not even pause in her sweeping. "No, Señor, I must go soon." "You do not understand," Jace said, stepping closer. "This is not a regular storm. The trail will be gone by the time you are halfway down. You will be walking in the dark." She stopped sweeping then and looked at him. Her face was pale in the flat gray light, her hair whipping across her cheeks. "I cannot stay. I am telling you, it is dangerous. You will freeze out there." "I must go," she said again. There was no defiance in her voice. There was something else, a raw, brittle desperation that stunned him. It was not a choice for her. She set the broom against the wall, pulled her thin shawl from her bag, and wrapped it tightly around her head and shoulders. She was preparing to leave. A spike of frustration, sharp and hot, shot through Jace. "Why?" he demanded. "What is in that town that is worth dying for on the trail?" She flinched, as if he had struck her, but she just shook her head. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and stepped off the porch, heading for the path. Jace watched her go. He watched her lean into the wind, her small body fighting the first gusts. A knot of deep, primal unease tightened in his gut. It was the same feeling he got just before an ambush. It was the instinct that told him the world was out of balance. This was wrong. She was not just stubborn. She was running towards something, or running for something. He would not let this go. The puzzle of the biscuit, the refusal of shelter, the desperation in her eyes, it all clicked into place. He moved, not toward her, but toward his horse. He saddled the stallion, his movements swift and silent. He did not take the trail. He was Comanche. He made his own. He urged the horse up the rocky slope behind his cabin, gaining the high ridge that ran parallel to the switchback trail. From here, he could see the whole valley. He was a ghost on the skyline, hidden by rock and juniper. Below him, perhaps half a mile away, he could see her small, dark shape. She was moving fast, almost jogging, slipping and sliding on the loose gravel, fighting the wind that threatened to push her from the narrow path. He followed. He kept the stallion at a silent walk, his own eyes tracking her every move. She was a woman driven. He expected her to follow the path all the way down to the valley floor, to the fork that led west to Dust Creek. But she did not. When she reached the fork, she did not turn west, she turned east. Jace pulled his stallion to a halt. His blood ran cold, east, toward the abandoned railroad line, toward the Badlands, a desolate, dry canyon where nothing lived but snakes and coyotes. No one went there. There was nothing there. His curiosity sharpened into a cold, hard dread. He pushed the stallion forward, staying high on the ridge, the wind muffling the sound of the horse's hooves. He watched her leave the main trail and follow a small, dry riverbed, a scar of white rock and sand, deeper into the hidden canyon. After another mile, she disappeared behind a towering outcrop of red rock. Jace dismounted. He tied the stallion to a dead tree, his movements economical. He would continue on foot. He moved over the rock without a sound. He was a warrior again. His senses on fire, he slipped down the side of the ridge, his boots finding silent holes in the stone. He smelled it before he saw it. A thin, desperate wisp of wood smoke, instantly shredded by the wind. He rounded a massive boulder and froze. It was not a cabin. It was not even a house. It was a hovel, a shack, hammered together from scraps. Pieces of rusted tin, old railroad ties, cracked planks, and sun-baked mud. It was pushed up against the canyon wall, trying to borrow shelter from the rock. The wind howled around it, threatening to tear it apart. A piece of old burlap, stiff with dirt, served as the door. Jace stopped, concealing himself behind a thicket of cholla cactus, perhaps 50 yards away. He watched. Elena did not go in immediately. She paused by the burlap flap, her back to him. He saw her shoulders slump, as if she were letting go of a massive weight. She took a deep breath. He saw her wipe her face with her hands. Then she pulled the burlap aside. "Mama!" The cry was thin, but sharp. It was followed by a crash and a scramble. 4 children burst from the shack. Jace's heart stopped. He physically recoiled, flattening himself against the rock. 4. They swarmed her. A girl, the tallest, looked to be about 11 or 12 years old. She had the same dark hair, the same serious eyes. She grabbed Elena's arm. "Mama, you are late. The wind is bad." Her voice was a sharp mix of scolding and pure relief. 2 boys, identical twins, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, scrambled out after her. They were barefoot, their feet black with grime despite the cold ground. Their faces were streaked with dirt. They wore shirts that were little more than rags. They did not speak. They just launched themselves at Elena, each one grabbing a leg, burying their faces in her skirt. And last, a tiny girl, so small she could not have been more than 4, stumbled out. She was pale, her eyes huge and dark in her small face. She did not run. She just stood in the doorway, her thumb in her mouth, until Elena reached for her. The woman Jace knew, the silent, stoic, hard-working Elena, vanished. In her place was a mother. "I am here," she murmured, kneeling in the dirt, the wind tearing at her hair. She pulled the tiny girl against her chest. She stroked the boy's hair. "I am here, my love. I hurried." Her voice was not the flat, polite tone she used with him. It was soft. It was warm. It was like music. She settled them, her hands moving, touching each one. She looked at the eldest. "Are you all right? Mia, did you keep the fire?" "Yes, Mama, but it is so cold." Then Elena reached into her pocket. She pulled out the small, cloth-wrapped bundle, the one Jace had watched her pack away at lunch. She unwrapped it. It was the other half of the biscuit. She carefully broke the small piece into 4 tiny portions. She gave 1 piece to each child. The children did not savor it. They ate it instantly, greedily, like starving animals. The oldest girl chewed her portion slowly, but her eyes never left Elena's face. Jace's stomach clenched. The puzzle was solved. The mystery of the uneaten food. The reason she refused him. She was not eating because she was bringing it here. The eldest girl tugged her inside. Jace shifted, moving a few feet, straining to see. Through the open flap, he saw the inside. It was dark. A pitifully small fire glowed in a ring of stones on the dirt floor. There was no furniture. There was nothing. Just piles of old blankets and rags in the corners. No food. No supplies. Nothing. He felt a sudden, blinding flash of rage. It was hot and bitter in his throat. It was not anger at her. It was anger at the entire, brutal world. He was a millionaire. He slept in a warm cabin. And this woman, this brave, silent woman, was keeping 4 children alive in a tin box with half a biscuit a day. The generous silver coins he paid her, it was not for savings. It was for this. It was the only thing keeping them from freezing or starving to death. He backed away. He moved as silently as he had approached. His mind was reeling. He was a man who lived by a simple, hard code. He did not get involved. He kept his distance. He turned and began the climb back up the ridge. He walked through the sleet, the ice stinging his face, but he did not feel it. All he could see was the image of 4 small hands, reaching for 4 tiny pieces of bread. He reached his stallion, swinging into the saddle. He rode back to his cabin, the fortress on the cliff. He stood on his porch, the storm now fully unleashed, and looked down into the dark valley. The isolation he had so carefully built around himself felt different now. It no longer felt like strength. It felt like a betrayal. He was tied to her now. Whether he wanted to be or not, he was the keeper of her desperate secret. And he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he could no longer just stand by and watch. The day after the sleet storm, the sky was a high, brilliant blue, washed clean of all dust. Jace Redhawk said nothing. When Elena Morales arrived, shivering, her thin shawl crusted with ice from the pre-dawn walk, he merely grunted a greeting from the stable, where he was already at work. He did not mention the hovel. He did not mention the 4 children. He acted as if he had spent the night in his own cabin, alone with the wind. But everything had changed. He had spent the night staring into his fire. The image of those 4 small, hungry faces burned into his mind. He was a wealthy man. He could ride down to that hovel, throw a bag of gold at her feet, and solve her problems. He knew she would throw it back. He had recognized the look in her eyes, that brittle, unyielding thing he had mistaken for simple toughness. It was not toughness. It was pride. It was the only armor she had left. He was a warrior, and he respected armor. To offer her charity would be to strike her in the face. It would be a violation. So he planned, he would not offer, he would provide. His cabin, which she had scrubbed clean, was now his primary tool. When she stepped inside, she paused. The change was subtle, but it was there. The stack of firewood beside the hearth was now immense, piled high to the ceiling. She began, turning. Jace spoke before she could, his voice gruff. He was repairing the leather hinge on the front door. The cabin must be kept warm. The damp from the storm is bad for the leather. It warps the rifle stocks. Keep the fire high all day. She just nodded, accepting the logic. It was a command about his property, not a kindness for her comfort. He had also restocked his pantry from a hidden cache he kept in a root cellar. The shelves, which had been functional, were now overflowing. Sacks of flour, beans, coffee, and tins of lard. The stable rebuild will take weeks, he said, not looking at her as she began her work. I do not have time to ride to town for supplies every few days. I bought it in bulk. He was building a defensive logic, walling her off from the truth of his intentions. Later that day, as she was sweeping the floor, he finally broke the working silence between them. You are not from Dust Creek, he stated. She stopped sweeping. Her back was to him. No, senor. Your accent, it is from the border, south. She turned slowly. She was wary, her eyes guarded. Yes, near Laredo. It is a long way to walk, he said, ostensibly polishing a saddle. But his attention was entirely on her. What brought you so far north? Elena looked down at the broom in her hands. He saw her knuckles whiten. She was deciding what to tell him. What was safe? My husband, he was a vaquero, a good one. He is dead, she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. A story told so many times it was worn smooth. There was a dispute over grazing land. Some white ranchers said our small ranch was on their line. The line moved. It always moves. Jace stopped his work. He knew that story. He had seen that line move his entire life. They came one night, she continued, her voice a monotone. They said he pulled a gun. He did not, but it did not matter. When it was over, he was dead, and we had no land. We, Jace asked, his voice quiet. Elena's eyes flickered, realizing her mistake. My family, she said vaguely. I have a family to care for. I came here. I heard there was work. She was hiding them. She was ashamed of the hovel, terrified he would find out about the children. The secret was her heaviest burden. Jace let the silence sit for a moment. Then he walked toward her. She flinched, taking a small step back, her hand gripping the broom handle like a weapon. Jace stopped. He felt a sharp, painful ache in his chest. She was terrified of him. "Elena," he said, using her name for the first time. "The work here is hard. The walk is dangerous. The storm proved that. I am a rich man. I can pay you more. I can find you a room in town, a safe place." It was a mistake. Her head snapped up. The exhaustion in her eyes was replaced by a sudden, blazing fire. It was not anger. It was that steel. "Señor," she said, her voice low and cutting, "I came here to clean your cabin. I did not come here for your help. I do not take handouts." "It is not a handout. It is an offer." "I work for my pay," she said, cutting him off. "You pay me. That is the arrangement. Your pay is fair. I need nothing else from you." Jace looked at her for a long moment. He saw the pride, yes, but he also saw the fear beneath it. She was terrified that if she took one extra thing, she would owe him more than just labor. She would owe him herself. He nodded, a sharp, curt dip of his chin. "As you wish." He turned and walked out of the cabin, leaving her to her work. He had lost that battle. He would have to change his tactics. His new strategy began that evening. When Elena was finished, Jace was already inside the cabin, cleaning his rifle, his back to the room. He had accidentally left a thick wool blanket on a chair by the door. It was not one of his old ones. It was new, clean, and very warm. He also left a large piece of cured jerky and a small cloth sack of pinto beans on the edge of the kitchen table, as if he had been preparing a meal and been distracted. He heard her packing her small bag. He heard her pause. The silence stretched out. He did not turn. He kept his attention focused on the rifle, sighting down the barrel. He could feel her gaze on his back. He heard the faint brush of wool, then the soft slide of the beans and jerky being slipped into her bag. She said nothing. "Good night, Señor," she said, her voice tight. "Night," he grunted, still not looking. When the door closed, he let out a breath he did not know he was holding. It was a victory, but it tasted like deceit. This became their new, silent ritual. Every day there was something left over. A small sack of flour too close to the mice, a handful of dried apples, a tin of lard. She never took much, just what she could carry, just what was plausible. And the wall of polite, formal silence between them remained. Until the afternoon, the heat returned. The high-altitude sun was relentless, beating down on the mesa. Jace was working with his horses in the new corral, and Elena had taken on the task of scrubbing the last of the storm grit and horse manure from the new stable floor. It was brutal, hot, filthy work. She finished in the late afternoon, covered in grime, her dress soaked through with sweat. She looked exhausted, but she was finished. Jace was rubbing down his stallion when he saw her walk to the large water barrel on the side of the porch. It was the barrel he used for washing. She looked around. Jace was busy with the horse, his back to her. She must have thought she was unobserved. He heard the splash of water. He turned and froze. She had untied the kerchief from her hair, and her thick black hair had tumbled down her back. She was leaning over the barrel, her sleeves rolled up, splashing the cold water onto her face, her neck, and her chest. She gasped as the cold hit her hot skin. She scrubbed her face and neck, then dipped her hands in again, running them over her arms. She arched her back, lifting her heavy, damp hair off her neck, her eyes closed, a small sigh of relief escaping her. Jace's throat went dry. Her dress, the same patched, worn cotton, was dark with sweat, clinging to every line of her body. He could see the sharp, delicate line of her shoulder blades, the inward curve of her strong back, the flare of her hips. The fabric was plastered against her skin, where she had splashed the water. It was even more transparent, showing the darker skin of her arms and the plain cotton of her shift beneath. She was not beautiful, not in the way of the painted women in the Santa Fe saloons. She was real. Her skin was damp and glistening in the sun. She was all lean muscle and soft, womanly curves, hidden under layers of poverty and exhaustion. As if she felt his gaze, her eyes snapped open. She saw him. He was standing 20 feet away, motionless, his hand frozen on the horse's flank. A deep, painful blush spread from her neck all the way up to her hairline. Her eyes wide and startled, locked with his. In that one silent second, something passed between them. He was not Senor. She was not the help. He was a man. She was a woman. She immediately turned away, her movements fast and clumsy. She grabbed her shawl, pulling it around her shoulders, hiding her damp dress, her arms, her neck. She looked like a startled deer, ready to bolt. Jace felt like he had been kicked in the chest. His warrior's composure was shattered. He felt flustered. He dropped the curry comb, cursed, and bent to pick it up. "The horses need fresh water," he muttered, turning and walking abruptly back into the stable he had just left. He did not need to water the horses. He needed to get away from her, from the sudden, sharp, undeniable surge of his own blood. The next day, she was back to being the silent worker, but the wall between them was different. It was no longer just silence. It was charged. The proof of that charge came a week later. Jace had to ride into Dust Creek for supplies he could not fake, nails and saw blades. As he was leaving the general store, he passed the Buckhorn Saloon. The same men were on the porch. "Afternoon. Red Hawk," one of them drawled, his voice slick with insinuation. "Heard you got yourself some steady help up on the mountain." Jace kept walking. "Yeah," another voice snickered. "That little Morales woman? She is a hard worker, I bet, especially on her knees." A burst of ugly laughter followed. Jace stopped. He turned, very slowly. The men's laughter died, their smiles freezing. He walked back to the porch, moving with that silent, predator's grace. He did not reach for his gun. He did not need to. He stopped at the bottom step and looked up at the man who had spoken. "She is a decent woman," Jace said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She works for me. You will not speak her name again." The cowboy, bolstered by his friends and the alcohol, puffed out his chest. "Or what? Chief, you will." Jace moved. He was up the steps in one motion. He grabbed the front of the man's shirt, hauling him off his feet and slamming him against the porch post. The wood cracked. "Or I will break your jaw," Jace whispered, his face inches from the man's. "And if I hear her name in your mouth again, I will cut out your tongue. Do you understand me?" The man, his face white with terror, nodded frantically. Jace shoved him back. The man stumbled and fell into a chair. Jace looked at the other men. They looked away, suddenly fascinated by their boots. He walked away, mounted his horse, and rode out of town. He was furious. Not at the men. He expected that from them. He was furious that they had dared to touch her, even with their words. When Elena arrived the next morning, he was waiting for her, his face a mask of cold anger. "I was in town," he said, his voice tight. "There are rumors." Elena's hand went to her throat. Her face went pale. "They are speaking of you and me in a disrespectful way. I handled it." She looked at him, and her eyes were not grateful. They were wide with a new, colder terror. "What did you do?" she whispered. "I told them to stop," he said. "I made it clear." "No," she said, shaking her head, backing away. "No, you cannot. Please, Senor." "I will not have them insult you," he said, frustrated by her reaction. "But do you not see?" she pleaded, her voice breaking for the first time. She grabbed his sleeve, her fingers biting into his arm. "If you do this, if you handle it, they will know. They will say the rumors are true. They will say I am your woman. And when this job is done, when you do not need me, no one else will hire me. The ranchers' wives, the hotel, no one will give work to the Indian's whore. Do you not understand? You are not protecting me. You are ruining me." She let go of him, her hand covering her mouth, her shoulders shaking. "My family, we will starve." Jace stood frozen. He saw the truth of it. His civilized, white man's reaction defending her honor was a luxury she could not afford. Her defense was her silence, her endurance. She survived by being invisible, by taking the insults, as long as it meant she could take the pay. And he, in his arrogance, had just painted a target on her back. He felt a deep, profound shame. He, a warrior, had used the wrong weapon and wounded the very person he was trying to protect. "I did not see," he said. It was the closest he could come to an apology. She just nodded, wiping her eyes, her face already regaining its stoic mask. "I must work," she said, and hurried past him into the cabin. That night, Jace lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling. The cabin was spotless. It smelled of soap and wood smoke, and the faint herbal scent of her skin. He had wanted her, physically. He had respected her, for her pride. But now, he felt something else. He felt the deep, gut-wrenching ache of her plea. He saw the world through her eyes, a world that was so much more brutal than his own, where even a defense was a kind of attack. He realized he was not just attracted to her. He was not just protecting a decent woman. He was, in a way he had not been with anyone in a decade, completely and terrifyingly in love with her. Miles away, in the dark, cold hovel, Elena lay awake. The children were asleep. One of them curled tightly against her back, another at her feet. They were warm under Jace's wool blanket. She listened to the wind howling outside, and she thought of him. She thought of his face, dark with rage. In that saloon, he had fought for her. She felt a small, treacherous flicker of warmth in her chest. She had not felt that in so long. A man fighting for her, not with her. She immediately crushed it. Men were in danger. Men with money and power were the worst kind of danger. They were the men who had killed her husband. They were the men who thought they could buy anything. Jace Redhawk was kind, in his way, but he was rich, he was powerful, and he was a man. To feel anything for him was a weakness she could not afford. It was a path that led only to more pain. She had 4 reasons, breathing softly in the dark, to never, ever be that weak again. The truce between them, brokered by her fear and his shame, was fragile. Jace Redhawk watched Elena Morales move, and he saw a different woman. He saw the mother, the protector, the refugee, and the tension in his cabin. Once a simple matter of male and female proximity became something deeper, sharper, and far more painful. He saw the evidence of her plea that very week. Elena had always taken 1 day a week away from the mountain, a day he assumed she spent with her family or doing other work. This time, she returned to the cabin not on her usual morning, but late the following afternoon. Jace was repairing a bridle on the porch when he saw her. She was not just walking, she was stumbling. Her face was a pale, grayish color under her tan, and her eyes were hollowed out, empty of their usual steel. He said nothing as she approached, but his gut clenched. She walked past him, her head down, and went straight to the water barrel, drinking cup after cup, as if she had been walking for a day. "You missed a day," he said, his voice flat. She nodded, her back to him, her hand gripping the edge of the barrel. "You went to Dust Creek," he guessed. "To your other job, the laundry at the hotel?" "Yes, I went," she whispered. "Mrs. Abernathy," Jace said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "She heard the rumors from the saloon, the ones I started." Elena turned. There were no tears. She was beyond tears. She just looked exhausted to the bone. "She said she cannot have my sort touching her clean sheets," she said to a woman who spends her time alone on the mountain with. She stopped. "With a redskin," Jace finished for her, his voice a low growl. "She did not pay me for 2 weeks of work. Jay stood up. The leather bridle fell from his hands. 2 weeks for a woman living on half biscuits. 2 weeks of pay was not an inconvenience. It was a catastrophe. He saw the hovel in his mind. He saw the 4 children. "I will go down there," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I will get your money." "No!" Her voice was sharp, desperate. "Please, you will only make it worse. You will make it true. It is done. The money is gone. I must find other work." But they both knew. There was no other work. He had made her notorious. He stood there, trapped in his own guilt. He was a millionaire, but his money was useless. He had tried to be a warrior, and he had cost her everything. He pondered for a long, silent minute. He could not offer charity. He could not use force. He had to use the only thing left, his mind, the white man's part of him. He had to create a new, logical arrangement. "The stable is almost finished," he said, walking past her into the cabin. He felt her freeze. He knew what she was thinking. The cleaning was done. The stable was done. He was firing her. "The dust is gone," he continued, walking to the cold hearth. "But this cabin is not right." He turned to face her. "I am leaving for Santa Fe in 10 days. I have meetings with bankers, with men from the railroad. I cannot go looking like this." He gestured to his own buckskin shirt, to the layer of dust on his good boots. "My clothes are clean, but they are stiff. They smell of lye. I have been eating jerky and canned beans for 6 months. I am tired of it." He looked her in the eye. "I am offering you a new job. Not cleaning. The cleaning is finished. I need a housekeeper. I need someone to cook. Real food. I need my clothes washed, ironed. I need this place managed like a white man's home, not a warrior's lodge. It is more work. It is different work." He walked to the lockbox where he kept his money. "I was paying you 50 cents a day. That was for cleaning, housekeeping, cooking, laundry, that is $1. Every day." He saw the flicker in her eyes, the desperate calculation. She was trapped, but he had given her an honorable way out. He was not offering a gift. He was offering a promotion. She swallowed, her throat working. "I can cook," she said, her voice quiet, but regaining a fraction of its steel. "I can wash. It is work. I accept the work." "Good," Jace said, turning away, pretending it was a simple business deal. "Start now. I am hungry." The cabin changed. It was no longer just clean. It became a home. For the first time since he had built it. Jace Redhawk came in from a day of breaking horses not to a cold, silent room, but to the smell of stew. He would enter and find Elena by the fire, a pot bubbling, the air thick with the scent of chili, onions, and slow-cooked meat. She found wild herbs on the mountainside and hung them from the rafters to dry, filling the room with the sharp, clean smells of sage and thyme. She baked cornbread, thick and yellow, or flat, perfect tortillas, stacked and kept warm by the fire. She washed his clothes, and they came back not just clean, but soft, smelling of soap and sun. She added small things, a jar of wildflowers on the table, a cushion, mended and restuffed, for his chair. Jace found himself sitting by the fire, eating from a plate, watching her. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her presence filling the empty spaces he had lived in for so long. He had been a hermit on a cliff. Now, he was a man coming home for dinner. The feeling was deeply comforting, and it terrified him. He was becoming accustomed to her. The weather held for a week, a perfect, warm stretch of late autumn. Then, one night, the world changed. It started not with wind, but with a heavy, oppressive stillness. The air was thick, humid, and carried a metallic charge. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple. Elena, who was packing away the supper dishes, kept glancing nervously out the window. "The air is sick," she said, her voice quiet. "It will rain," Jace said, checking the seals on his window. No, senor, this is more than rain. This is a mountain storm. She was right. The first rumble of thunder was not a crack. It was a low, guttural vibration that seemed to come from the rock beneath their feet. Elena began to pack her bag, her movements quick and anxious. I must go now, before it breaks. You are not listening, Jace said, looking out the window. It is already here. As he spoke, the sky ripped open. A fork of white-blue lightning struck the opposite ridge, illuminating the valley in a ghastly, flickering light. It was followed, not by a pause, but by an immediate, deafening crack that sounded like the mountain itself was splitting in two. And then came the rain. It was not raining. It was a solid wall of water, a deluge that hit the cabin roof with the sound of 1,000 drums. Elena ran to the door, her face pale. The children. She stopped, her hand over her mouth. Jace ignored her slip. He came to the door 1 second before her. He did not just block her way. He slammed the heavy wooden bar into its iron brackets. A solid, final sound. No, he said. You cannot keep me, she cried, her eyes wide with panic. She grabbed his arm. Let me go. Please, I have to go. Stop, Jace commanded, his voice a roar over the storm. He grabbed her shoulders, his fingers biting into her thin dress. He was not angry. He was desperate to make her see. Listen to me. Forget the trail. Look. He dragged her to the window. Another flash of lightning lit the world. The path she took down the mountain, the narrow switchback, was no longer there. It had become a churning river of brown mud and white, foaming water. As they watched, a boulder the size of his stallion dislodged from the cliff above and crashed down, tumbling through the very space she would have been occupying. Elena made a small, choked sound. She sagged against him, her body going limp with the shock of what she had just seen. You would be dead, Jace said, his voice low and harsh. You would be at the bottom of the canyon. You are staying here. That is final. He led her, unresisting, to the fire. She was shaking, not from cold, but from sheer terror. The cabin, once his fortress, was now their ark, a small wooden box in a world of roaring water. The rain was relentless. It found every crack. Water began to drip from the ceiling. The wind howled, a high-pitched scream. Elena's dress was soaked, just from her run to the door and back. She was shivering violently, her teeth chattering. You will freeze, Jace said. He was awkward, clumsy in this new, domestic territory. Go by the fire. Your dress. You must dry it. He turned his back, a deliberate, formal gesture of privacy. He heard her hesitate. He heard the whisper of wet fabric. He did not look. He grabbed the heaviest fur he owned, a thick bear pelt, from his cot. When he turned back, she was standing by the fire, her back to him. She had hung her patched dress over a stool. She was standing in her shift. It was a plain, thin cotton garment, worn almost to transparency, and it was damp, clinging to her. In the firelight, he could see the silhouette of her body, the sharp line of her spine, the soft curve of her hips. Her hair was down, a heavy black curtain dripping onto the floor. He stepped forward and wrapped the heavy fur around her shoulders, his hands brushing her neck. Her skin was cold. She flinched, but pulled the fur tightly around her, hiding herself, burying her face in the thick hair. Here, he said, his voice rough. He poured a cup of corn whiskey from his flask. Drink, it is medicine. For the chill. She took it, her small hand trembling against his. She drank, coughed as the raw liquor hit her throat. But she drank it all. A small spot of color returned to her cheeks. They sat. He took a stool on one side of the hearth. She sat on the floor on the other, wrapped in the bear pelt. The only sound was the roar of the storm and the crackle of the fire. The air in the cabin was thick, charged with the storm, the whiskey, and their proximity. This noise Jace said, staring into the flames. "It reminds me of the nights before a raid, when the sky holds its breath." Elena looked at him, her eyes dark over the edge of the fur. "You were a warrior?" It was not a question. He nodded. I rode with the Quahati. I saw the last of the free days." He fell silent, his past unspooling in the flames. He spoke, not to her, but to the fire. "Then the soldiers came, the reservations. They put us on bad land that would not even grow weeds. They fed us rotten meat. I watched my cousins die of starvation." His voice was flat, but edged with a cold, ancient anger. "I would not die that way. I would not be a dog begging for scraps. So I learned their language. I learned their ways. I became a guide, an interpreter. I took their money." He gestured around the cabin, at the proof of his wealth. "I found the silver in their hills. I let them dig it up, and I took their paper. And I used that paper to buy back the land they stole, piece by piece. I am still a warrior. Elena, this is just a different kind of war." Elena watched him, her fear of him slowly being replaced by something else. Understanding. "You fight for your land," she said, her voice a whisper. "I just fight for my children." Jace turned his head. "You said your husband, the vaquero, died. You said you had family to care for." She looked down, her hand tracing the rim of the tin cup. The whiskey, the storm, the shared confession it broke the final wall. "He was my first husband, my good husband. He gave me 2 of the children, the oldest girl and the youngest." "And the other 2? Jace asked softly. "The twins, the boys. They were my brothers. He and his wife died of the fever last winter. I was all they had." She took a shaky breath. "But the ranchers are not the reason I hide. The reason I am where I am. It is my other husband." Jace went very still. "Your other husband." "My American husband, Silas Grady. I met him after my husband died. I was alone. With 4 children, I was desperate. He was charming. He spoke Spanish. He promised protection." Her face hardened into a mask of bitter memory. "He was a liar, a gambler, a drunkard." Her voice dropped so low. Jace had to lean in to hear her over the rain. "He used his hands on me, but I could bear that. I know how to bear that. But then he lost everything. All my husband's savings. All of it. And he made a deal." She was shaking again, but with rage now. "He tried to sell them, the twins, to a man who finds labor for the mines. $100. Jace felt a cold, murderous fury rise in his throat. "I heard them," she whispered, tears now streaming down her face, bright in the firelight. "I heard them haggling. That night I took the children. I took nothing else. I just ran. I have been running for a year. That is why I live in a hovel. That is why I cannot take your charity, your help, because I am still his wife. On paper, in the white man's law, he owns me. And he owns them." Her voice broke. "If he finds me, if he knows I am here, with you, a rich man, he will come, not just for me, but for them. He will take them, and the law will let him. The law will say they are his property." Jace stood up, his body vibrating with a violence he had not felt in years. "Where is he?" "No," she cried, scrambling to her feet, grabbing his arm. The fur blanket fell to the floor. "No, Jace, please, you do not understand. He is not just one man. He is a killer. He has friends. The only way is to hide. To be invisible, promise me. Promise me you will not look for him." As she screamed the words, the world exploded. A bolt of lightning struck the cliff face directly outside the cabin. It was not a flash. It was a solid pillar of white fire. The sound was not thunder. It was an apocalypse. The cabin shook to its foundations. Elena screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure terror. She did not just startle. She launched herself away from the shaking wall, away from the window, and collided directly with Jace. He reacted as a warrior, grabbing the incoming force, wrapping his arms around it to control it. But it was her. She crashed into his chest, her momentum carrying them both back a step. His arms were locked around her. She was in his lap as he stumbled, tangled with him, her face buried in his buckskin shirt. He could feel her whole body, shaking, terrified. He could feel her heart hammering against his ribs. A frantic bird in a cage. Her wet hair was against his face, his neck. He smelled the soap, the whiskey, and the clean, female scent of her skin. The world stopped. The roar of the storm faded. There was no Silas. There was no war. There was only the solid, warm weight of her in his arms. He held her, his hand splayed on her back, feeling the tremor in her muscles. She lifted her head. Her eyes were inches from his. They were huge, dark, and swimming with tears and terror. Her lips were parted, her breath coming in short, quick gasps. He saw her fear, but beneath it, in the deepest, darkest part of her eyes, he saw something else, a flicker of the same raw, hungry need that was tearing through him. He lowered his head. He was not thinking. He was only feeling. He saw her eyes flutter, start to close. His lips were a breath away from hers. "I cannot." The whisper was so quiet, it was almost stolen by the wind. Her hands, which had been clutching his shirt, moved to his chest. She pushed. It was not a strong push, but it was absolute. Jace froze. The spell was broken. She scrambled off his lap, pulling away from him, retreating to the other side of the fire. She snatched up the bear pelt, pulling it around her like a shield. She was shaking, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I cannot." Jace stood, his body aching with the frustrated need. He felt the sharp, cold sting of rejection. But then he looked at her. She was not looking at him with disgust or anger. She was looking at the floor, her body rigid with pure, unadulterated fear. And he understood. She had just told him her story. A charming man who offered protection. A man who had used her, beaten her, and tried to sell her children. She was not rejecting him. She was rejecting dependency. She was terrified of being weak, of trusting another man, of falling into the same trap. He let out a long, slow breath, his anger and his desire cooling, replaced by a deep, aching comprehension. He walked to his own cot and picked up his own blanket. He did not approach her. He gave her the space she needed. "You have nothing to be sorry for," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. He looked at her, his gaze steady, letting her see the truth in his eyes. "You ran from him. You are raising 4 children in a hole in the ground. You are stronger than any warrior I have ever known." He paused, the silence stretching. "When you are ready," he said, "I will be here." Elena looked up, her eyes meeting him. She did not speak. She just nodded, a tiny, jerky motion. Jace turned, walked to his cot on the far side of the room, and lay down, pulling his blanket over him. Elena stayed where she was, on her side of the hearth, wrapped in the heavy fur. The fire burned low between them, a small, contained warmth. Outside, the storm raged, the wind screaming, the rain lashing the cabin. But inside, for the first time, there was a different kind of quiet. They were separated by a space of 10 feet, but it was a canyon of fear and old wounds. And yet, in the heart of the storm, neither of them was alone. The storm passed, leaving the air clean and cold. But the fragile peace it had forged inside the cabin could not last. The world outside, the world of men, was beginning to press in. The rumors Jace had tried to stamp out in Dust Creek did not die. They festered, they mutated. The story of the wild Indian on the mountain had a new chapter. Now, it was the story of the rich Indian and the little Mexican woman who lived with him. And, as whispers do, it grew. Soon, the story included children, 4 of them. This new, more detailed rumor drifted on the wind. traveling from the Buckhorn Saloon to the distant ranching outposts. It traveled east, carried by a freighter, and was repeated in a smoky cantina 50 miles away. And there, it fell upon the right ear. The ear belonged to Silas Grady. He was no longer the charming, desperate drunkard Elena had fled. He was a harder man, leaner, his charm burned away by cheap whiskey and malice. He had found his true calling. He was now a gunman, wearing a pistol tied low on his hip, riding for a man who paid well for men with no conscience. His employer was Colonel Hargrove. Hargrove was a man who had never been a colonel in any army, but he liked the title. He was a land speculator, a gun runner, and a shadow player in the territory's expansion. He was currently in the business of acquiring land by any means necessary for the incoming railroad, and he had a particular interest in a stretch of valley that included Wild Mesa. The mesa had the only reliable, year-round spring in 50 miles. It was also the territory of Jace Red Hawk. Hargrove had tried to buy Jace out. He had tried to threaten him. The Comanche had simply looked at him with those flat, cold eyes and told him the land was not for sale. When Silas Grady, one of his newest hires, overheard the rumor about Jace Red Hawk, he went very still. He listened as a drunken cowboy described the Mexican woman, her dark hair, her proud silence, and the 4 half-starved children she kept hidden in a hovel. "Elena," Silas whispered, a slow, ugly smile spreading across his face. He put down his whiskey. He went to find his new boss. Colonel Hargrove listened to Silas Grady's story with calculating interest. "His wife, you say?" Hargrove stroked his gray, tobacco-stained beard. "Legally, on paper," Silas said, his voice greasy with opportunity. "I got the certificate right in my satchel. She ran off, stole my property." "The children?" Hargrove asked. "2 of them are hers by her first dead husband. 2 of them are her brothers. But she is mine, and in the eyes of the law, what is hers is mine. They are assets. Colonel, assets I mean to reclaim." Hargrove smiled. He finally saw the lever he could use to pry that stubborn Comanche off his land. It was not guns. It was not money. It was the law. "Indeed, Mr. Grady, indeed, you are a wronged man. And I believe the territory of New Mexico is very sympathetic to a wronged white man, especially when the other party is well. Let us ride to Dust Creek. I believe you have a family to reunite with." Elena felt the change 3 days before she saw it. It was a feeling on her skin, a return of the old, metallic taste of fear. The children were restless in the hovel, the eldest girl watching the mouth of the canyon, her young face set in a permanent frown. One afternoon, as Elena was on the trail back from the mesa, she saw him. He was just standing there, in the middle of the path, blocking her way. 2 other men with the same hard, empty eyes as he flanked him. But her gaze was locked on the center figure. It was Silas. He was wearing new clothes, a fine black coat and a clean hat. He looked well-fed. He looked dangerous. "Hello, Elena," he said, his voice just as she remembered it, that smooth, charming tone that hid the rot underneath. Elena's blood turned to ice. She took a step back, her hand flying to her throat. The bag of extra food Jace had given her suddenly felt like a ton of bricks. "Silas," she whispered. "You have been hard to find, my dear. A man worries." He took a step toward her. "Running off like that, taking what is mine." "They are not yours," she said, her voice shaking, but she stood her ground. "You know they are not." "They are hers," a new voice cut in. Colonel Hargrove stepped out from behind a boulder. He was smiling, a fatherly, poisonous expression. "And you, my dear, are his. The law is very clear on that." From inside the hovel, a few yards away, the burlap flap rustled. The oldest girl, her face white with terror, looked out. She saw Silas. She made a small, choked sound and yanked the flap shut. "Ah, the little ones," Silas said, his gaze shifting to the hovel. "Get on out here, kids. Your papa is home." "Leave them alone!" Elena screamed, moving to stand between him and the shack. "What do you want, Silas?" "What do I want?" he laughed. "I want my loving wife, of course, and my property, you, them." He gestured to the hovel. "This is a poor place." "Elena, I hear your new friend pays better, but that arrangement is over. You are coming with me." He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh. Elena cried out, a sharp sound of pain and fear. "Get your hands off her!" The voice was not a shout. It was low, cold, and heavy as a block of ice. It cut through the canyon. Silas dropped Elena's arm as if he had been burned. He and the other men spun, their hands moving to their guns. Jace Redhawk was sitting on his stallion on the ridge just above them. He had not ridden the trail. He had come cross-country, silent as a ghost. He had been checking his horse lines when his instincts screamed at him. He had seen the strange horses tethered in the dry wash. He urged the stallion down the steep embankment, the horse sliding on its haunches, arriving at the bottom in a cloud of dust and rock. He did not dismount. He did not draw his rifle from its scabbard. He simply sat there, high above them, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. His eyes were not on Silas. They were on Elena, on the red marks blooming on her arm. "This is a private, family matter. Indian," Hargrove said, stepping forward, his hand raised in a placating gesture. "This is Mr. Grady. He is here to reclaim his wife." "She is here," Jace said, his voice flat, "because I pay her to work. She is not your property. She is not his." "Oh, but that is where you are wrong, Chief," Silas sneered, his courage returning, bolstered by Hargrove's presence. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded, stained piece of paper. He waved it in the air. "I got the law right here, a marriage certificate, signed and sealed. She is my wife, and those kids are my responsibility. I am just a father, trying to take my family home." He smiled, his eyes glinting. "And you are the man who has been keeping her, hiding her, coaxing her up to your little mountain nest every day." He looked at Hargrove, then back at Jace. "The word for that, I believe, is kidnapping, or maybe just wife-stealing. The court in Santa Fe will be very interested to hear all about it. A United States citizen. His family was stolen by a savage." Jace saw the trap. It snapped shut around him, cold and sharp as steel. This was not a fight. It was an execution, planned by Hargrove, using Silas as the bullet and the law as the gun. Elena was shaking, her face ashen. "He is just my employer. Silas, I swear I cleaned his cabin, that is all." "Tell it to the judge," Silas said, laughing. He turned to Hargrove. "I think we have made our point. We will let the marshal handle it from here." He looked back at Elena, his smile gone. "You stay put, wife. When the marshal comes, you just tell him the truth. Tell him you are ready to come home." The three men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving a thick, choking silence in the canyon. Elena collapsed, sinking to her knees in the dirt, her body racked with dry, silent sobs. That night, Jace sat on the edge of the cliff, high above his cabin. The world was vast and silent, the stars like chips of ice in the black sky. Below, in the cabin he had insisted she and the children move into, a single candle burned. He had moved them from the hovel immediately. He had not asked. He had told her. For once, she had not argued. She was broken. He stared into the darkness, his mind at war. The Comanche in him, the warrior, had a simple solution. He knew where Silas and Hargrove were. They were in the Buckhorn Saloon, celebrating. He could be down there in an hour. He could kill them. He could take their scalps and be back before dawn. It would be simple. It would be just... But the other part of him, the man who owned a silver mine and read contracts, knew the truth. That was the old way. And the old way was dead. If he killed them, he would prove Silas right. He would be the savage. Hargrove had men. The railroad had soldiers. They would not call it a fight. They would call it an uprising. They would send the cavalry. They would burn his ranch, take his land, and they would send what was left of his people to a reservation in Florida. And what of Elena and the children? They would be taken, put in an orphanage or given to Silas, and he would be hanging from a rope or shot. No, violence was Hargrove's trap. He could not fight this with a knife. He had to fight it with their own weapon, the one they were using against him. He had to fight them with the law. He stood up, his decision made. It felt cold and foreign in his gut, but it was the only way. He walked back to the cabin and pushed the door open. Elena was sitting at the table, her head in her hands. The 4 children were asleep in a pile on his cot, safe for the first time in their lives. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. "We have to run. We have to run again." "No," Jace said. He walked to the table and sat across from her. "The running is over. But Silas the law, he will take them. He will try." Jace leaned forward, his gaze intense. "But he is not the only one who can use the law. I have money. I have contracts with the United States government. I am a citizen, just as he is. They want my silver. That gives me power." He reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. "We are not running. We are going to Santa Fe. We are going to go to that courthouse, and we are going to stand in front of that judge. And you are going to tell your story. I will hire the best lawyer in the territory. We will not let him win." Elena stared at him, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. "The court, Jace. No, they are white men, the judge, the lawyers. They will never listen to me. They will listen to him. He has the paper." "He has a piece of paper," Jace said, his voice hard. "But you have the truth, and you have me." He paused. "It is a risk. It is the biggest risk. But it is the only one we have." Elena looked at him, at his strong, scarred face, his eyes unwavering. She looked at her sleeping children. Running had not saved them. It had only delayed the inevitable. For a year, she had been a shadow, terrified of every knock, every strange face. She put her small, work-roughened hand on the table. "Do you fight with their weapons?" "This time," Jace said. "We do. We will beat them at their own game." She took a deep, shuddering breath and nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "We are going to Santa Fe." The next morning, at first light, a small, strange procession left Wild Mesa. Jace had bought a sturdy wagon from a neighboring rancher. Elena and the 4 children sat in the back, surrounded by blankets and provisions. Jace rode his stallion alongside, and behind them, 2 trusted Comanche warriors, men who worked for Jace and whose loyalty was absolute, rode as armed guards. They were heading east, toward the capital, toward the law, carrying their fear and a tiny, desperate sliver of hope. Santa Fe was not Dust Creek. It was a city of substance, built from the earth, with a large, imposing brick courthouse that sat on the plaza like a throne. An American flag, impossibly large, snapped in the wind on its roof. It was the heart of the white man's law in the territory, a place built of straight lines and rigid rules. To Jace, it felt like a prison. To Elena, it felt like a gallows. Jace had used his money well. He had secured rooms in a respectable hotel, away from the saloons. He had hired a lawyer, a young, earnest man named Alistair Reed, who seemed more interested in principle than in payment, though Jace paid him a small fortune anyway. The children were left in the hotel room under the watchful, armed guard of Jace's 2 Comanche men. Elena had been terrified to leave them, but Jace and Reed had been adamant. A courtroom was no place for them, and their presence would only be a distraction. Elena stood on the steps of the courthouse, her hands clenched so tightly her fingernails dug into her palms. Jace had bought her a new dress. It was simple, dark gray cotton, But it was clean, unpatched, and respectable. She hated it. She felt like she was in a costume for a play she did not understand. "It will be all right," Jace said, his voice low. He, too, was in costume. He wore a black broadcloth suit, a white shirt, and a string tie. He looked like a wealthy, civilized rancher. Only the long, black hair, tied back with a simple leather thong, and the flat, cold look in his eyes betrayed the warrior beneath. "They will not listen to me," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the heavy oak doors. "I am a Mexican. He is a white man. Alistair Reed is a white man." Jace said, "The judge is a white man. Today we use their rules. Come." The courtroom was enormous, with a high ceiling and dark wood benches. It smelled of floor polish, old paper, and sweat. It was already half full. Colonel Hargrove sat in the front row, looking like a respectable landowner, his hands folded on a silver-headed cane. And then she saw Silas. He was not the man from the canyon. Hargrove had cleaned him up. He was clean-shaven, his hair trimmed and oiled. He wore a new suit, a dark blue that made him look almost handsome. He sat at the plaintiff's table, looking at the floor, the very picture of a humble, wronged husband. Beside him sat a slick older lawyer with a satisfied smile, his desk piled with papers. Elena felt her stomach turn to water. The judge entered, a stern, gray-haired man named Barnaby. He looked out over the room with an air of profound impatience. When the proceedings began, Silas's lawyer, Mr. Fry, stood up. He was smooth, his voice like oiled leather. "Your Honor, this is a simple, tragic case, a case of a good-hearted man, my client, Mr. Silas Grady, who has been grievously wronged. His wife, Elena Morales Grady, a woman of unsteady temperament, abandoned his home, but she did not go alone. She abducted 4 children, his children, Your Honor." "Objection," Alistair Reed said, rising. "2 of those children are not his—" "A legal technicality." Fry waved his hand dismissively. "He was their stepfather, their provider. He loves them as his own. And she took them, Your Honor, vanished. For a year. My client has searched, his heart broken. And where does he find her? Not in a church, not in a decent home. He finds her living in sin with that man." Fry pointed a dramatic finger at Jace. The entire courtroom turned. Mr. Jace Redhawk, a Comanche, or so he claims, though he lives like a white man when it suits him. A man of mysterious wealth, derived from, let us say, unclear silver dealings. This man, this Redhawk, has been holding Mr. Grady's wife and children captive. He has used his money and his isolation to lure a desperate woman, to hold her against her will, to— "Objection!" Reed was on his feet, his face red. "This is slander. There is no proof of any of this." "Silence," Judge Barnaby commanded, his voice like gravel. He looked at Jace, his eyes cold and filled with a pre-formed judgment. "Mr. Reed, your client's reputation, shall we say, is known to this court. He is a tamed Indian. But let us be clear, Mr. Grady, whatever his profession, is a white man and the legal husband. His word carries the weight of a civilized citizen. Let us proceed. Mr. Fry." Jace sat as still as stone, his face unreadable. But Elena saw the muscle jump in his jaw. Fry presented his case. He produced the marriage certificate. It was legal. He produced 2 simple birth certificates for the twins, with Silas Grady listed as the father. A forgery Silas must have paid for. He painted a picture of Jace as a shadowy, uncivilized figure, a kidnapper who lived outside the bounds of the law, and Elena as a weak-minded, unfaithful wife. It was a fortress of lies, built on a foundation of prejudice. Then it was Reed's turn. He called Elena to the stand. She walked, her legs feeling like wood, and took the oath. Reed was kind, his voice gentle. "Mrs. Grady Elena, please, tell the court, in your own words, why you left your husband." Elena looked at the judge. She looked at the faces in the crowd, all white, all watching her. She looked at Silas, who was watching her with that snake smile.
"I ran,"
she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Speak up, woman," the judge barked. She flinched. She took a deep breath, and the fear in her eyes was replaced by that cold, hard steel Jace knew so well. "I ran," she said, her voice clear now, ringing with a sudden, desperate strength. "I ran because he is not a good man. He is a monster." "Objection!" Fry shouted. "Overruled," the judge said, waving a hand. "Let her speak. This is her defense." "He drank," Elena said, her gaze locked on the judge. "He hit me. He beat me. I could live with that." The courtroom rustled. "But he gambled. He lost all our money. We were starving. We had nothing. And he—" Her voice broke, but she forced it back. "He made a deal. I heard him. He tried to sell my boys, the twins. He said they were worth $100 apiece. To a man who sells children to the mines in the South?" A gasp went through the courtroom. Silas jumped to his feet. "She is lying. She is a crazy, lying." "Silence." "Mr. Grady," the judge roared. He looked at Elena, his expression now one of deep skepticism. "That is a terrible accusation, Mrs. Grady. A terrible and a fantastic one. Do you have any proof of this? A witness, a letter, anything at all?" Elena's face fell. The steel went out of her. "No," she whispered. "It was just me. I heard him. I just ran. I took the children and I ran." Mr. Fry stood up, his smile thin and triumphant. "Your Honor, a hysterical fantasy. A desperate lie from a woman caught in adultery, trying to justify the abandonment of her good, loving husband. She has no proof. She has no witnesses. She has only her word, which, as we have established, is unsteady. We rest our case." The judge sighed, looking at the papers. "This is a simple matter. The law is the law. Mr. Grady has a marriage certificate. He has birth certificates. The woman misses. Grady has only a wild, unproven story. I must side with the law. Custody of all four." "Your Honor," Alistair Reed said, his voice loud, cutting through the finality, "the defense is not finished. We have one more witness. We call Mrs. Inez de Leon to the stand." Colonel Hargrove, who had been relaxed, suddenly sat up straight. Silas's head snapped around, his face pale. A small, older woman, her hair pulled back in a severe gray bun, walked to the stand. She was Mexican, like Elena, but she carried herself with an air of iron authority. She owned the boarding house in the town Elena had fled. "Mrs. de Leon," Reed said, "do you know this man, Silas Grady?" Mrs. de Leon looked at Silas as if he were something she had found on the bottom of her shoe. "I do," she said, her voice crisp. "He lived in my house for 3 months, with Elena and the children." "And did you ever see him use his hands?" As Elena said. "Objection!" Fry yelled. "Hearsay!" "Overruled." "She is a character witness," the judge snapped, suddenly interested. "He beat her," Mrs. de Leon said simply, as if stating the time. "Twice a week, at least, after he came back from the saloon. He locked her in the room. We all heard it. We heard the children crying. He was a bad man, a devil." "A drunkard, not a criminal," Fry shouted. "But that is not all," Reed continued, his voice steady. "Did you ever see him with another man, a man inquiring about labor?" "Yes," she said. "A bad man, a man with a scarred face. They met in the saloon. Silas tried to hire my boy, Miguel, to help him, to convince Elena to sell the twins. When Miguel said no, Silas beat him. He beat my boy with a pistol, broke his arm." "Where is this boy?" the judge demanded. "He is right here," Reed said. "I call Miguel de Leon." A young man, no more than 20, walked to the stand. His left arm was bent at a strange, unnatural angle. He was terrified, but he looked at Elena, and he stood tall. "Tell the court what happened," Reed said. Miguel told his story. He told them about the scarred man. He told them about Silas's offer. He told them the man's name, a known slaver, and he told them the price. "He said the twins were strong," Miguel whispered, shaking. "He said $100 apiece. He said they were worth more than a broke horse." The words hung in the air, an exact echo of Elena's testimony. The courtroom exploded. People were shouting. Colonel Hargrove grabbed his cane, his face the color of ash. He turned to Silas, his eyes blazing, and made a sharp, cutting motion across his throat. "Be quiet." But Silas Grady was not a man of control. He was a creature of impulse, of rage. He had been exposed. The mask of the wronged husband was ripped away. He leaped to his feet, his new suit rumpled, his face a mask of purple rage. He pointed not at Elena, but at Miguel. "You lie, you little greaser bastard! You lie!" Then he spun to the judge. "It is all lies. She ran off. She is a thief, that Indian. He paid them all to lie. Those 4 brats are worth more than a broken horse, $100 apiece. You know that. That is good money. It was my money, my property." He stopped, his own words hanging in the dead, stunned silence of the room. He had confessed. In his rage, he had admitted to everything. Mr. Fry dropped his pencil, his face slack with disbelief. Colonel Hargrove closed his eyes, a look of pure, cold fury on his face. Judge Barnaby stared at Silas. The judge was a hard man. He was a prejudiced man, but he was not an evil man. He did not abide by the sale of children. "Mr. Grady," the judge said, his voice so cold it seemed to drop the temperature of the room. "You have just confirmed, in open court, under oath, that you view these children as chattel, as property to be sold." He banged his gavel, the sound like a gunshot. "This hearing is over, based on the testimony of Mrs. and Mr. DeLeon, and the impassioned confession of Mr. Grady himself. This court finds that he is a clear and present danger to these children and to their mother." He looked at Ellen. "Mrs. Grady, I am granting you full and temporary custody of all 4 children. Mr. Grady's parental rights are hereby suspended, pending a full criminal investigation into his activities, including trafficking and assault. You are free to go." He banged the gavel again. "This court is adjourned." For a moment, no one moved. Elena sat on the stand, her hands over her mouth, tears streaming through her fingers. Jace stood up, walked to her, and helped her down, his hand firm on her arm. As they walked out of the courtroom, Colonel Hargrove blocked their path. He was no longer smiling. He looked at Jace, his eyes like 2 chips of stone. "You are a clever man, Red Hawk, more clever than I thought. You used my own weapon against me." "I used the truth," Jace said, his voice flat. "The truth," Hargrove sneered. "The truth is just a story that enough people agree on. You won today, but this is not over. This is about land and water. It was always about that. You just made it complicated." He stepped aside. As Jace and Elena passed, he turned to Silas, who was being held by 2 marshals. Hargrove leaned in close, his voice a low, vicious whisper. "If the court will not give you the brats," he hissed, "we take them outside of it. You understand me?" Silas, his face a mask of hate, nodded. Jace and Elena walked out of the courthouse, into the bright, blinding sunlight of the plaza. Elena was shaking, leaning on Jace's arm, breathing in the free air. She was crying, but for the first time, they were not tears of fear. They were tears of release. They had won. The law, for one brief, shining moment, had been on their side. They were so lost in the moment, in the impossible, staggering relief of it, that they did not see the 2 men who detached themselves from the shadow of the saloon across the street. They did not see them mount their horses and ride slowly out of town. heading west, back toward Wild Mesa, back toward the narrow, winding canyon trail. The journey home was heavier than the journey out. The victory in the courthouse was a cold, thin thing, a piece of paper. The high desert was still the high desert, and Jace Red Hawk's instincts were screaming. They traveled for 2 days, the wagon creaking, the 4 children restless but quiet. The relief of their escape was overshadowed by the vast, empty country they had to cross. Jace rode his stallion, his gaze constantly sweeping the high ridges, the horizon, the heat shimmers. His 2 Comanche warriors, Hawk's Talon and Little Wolf, rode wide, one on each flank, their rifles held across their saddles. They were not guards, they were a patrol. Hargrove and Silas had been released. The criminal investigation, the judge had said, would take time. Jace knew what that meant. It meant they had a head start. On the evening of the 2nd day, they reached the mouth of the Scorpion's Tail, the narrow, winding canyon that was the only wagon path up to the high country toward Wild Mesa. "We do not go in," Jace said, his voice flat. He looked at the sun, a red ember touching the western peaks. "Not in the dark." Hawk's Talon nodded. "This is a bad place. The walls listen." They made a cold camp, hidden in a cluster of boulders a mile from the canyon entrance. Jace insisted on a low fire, just enough to warm some food for the children, shielded by rocks. The horses were picketed close. The children, exhausted by the tension, fell asleep quickly. They were piled together under Jace's heavy fur blankets in the wagon bed, a tangle of small, breathing bodies. Elena and Jace sat on watch, sharing a blanket against the cold, their backs against a wagon wheel. The 2 warriors took the perimeter, vanishing into the shadows. The silence of the desert night pressed in on them. Elena let out a long, slow breath. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The movement was small, hesitant, but it was an earthquake. It was the first time she had ever, willingly, rested against him. He did not move. He did not breathe. He just let her, his body a solid wall of warmth. "Jace," she said, her voice a murmur against his buckskin. He looked down. He could see the pale line of her forehead in the starlight. "Yes." "I was just thinking about the courthouse, about everything." She was quiet for a moment. "I just want them to have a place where they can run under a big sky and not be afraid of being hungry, not be afraid of being taken." He found her hand under the blanket, his rough fingers closing over her small, chapped ones. "They will," he said. His voice was a low promise. "I will build it." She squeezed his hand, a silent, powerful acknowledgement. They sat that way for hours, 2 small figures against a vast darkness, the fragile beginning of a family, guarded by ghosts. At the first hint of gray light, they were moving. Jace put the children in the wagon, his face grim. "When we are in the canyon," he told Elena, "you stay low. You keep them low. Do you understand?" She nodded, her face pale, her own fear a reflection of his. They entered the Scorpion's Tail. It was a narrow, deep scar in the earth, the walls rising up hundreds of feet on either side. The path was only 10 feet wide in places, littered with scree. It was a perfect trap. Jace hated it. His horse skittered, its ears flat, tasting the bad air. Hawk's Talon went in first, on foot, his rifle ready. Little Wolf stayed on the ridge above, moving parallel to them, a ghost among the rocks. Jace rode beside the wagon. They were halfway through, the narrowest part. The walls were sheer, the sky a thin blue ribbon above. The world exploded. The sound was not a gunshot. It was a wall of noise, a dozen rifles firing at once, the echoes amplifying the sound, making it seem like 100. A bullet screamed past Jace's head. His stallion reared, screaming in terror. Ambush Hawk's Talon roared from the rocks ahead. The wagon horses, untrained for battle, went mad. They lunged, their eyes white, The wagon slammed against the canyon wall, the wooden wheel shattering. The entire wagon pitched, groaning, and tipped onto its side, spilling blankets, provisions, and children onto the rocky ground. Elena screamed. Another volley of shots rained down from the cliffs. Hargrove's men. "The children get the children," Jace roared. Fighting his panicked horse, he swung down, his rifle in his hand. Elena was already moving. She was not a victim. She was a mother. She scrambled into the wreckage of the wagon, pulling the crying, terrified children out. The oldest girl, her face white, grabbed the youngest. "To the rocks!" Elena screamed, shoving them toward a small cave-in, a dark shadow under an overhang. "Crawl, do not move!" A bullet kicked up dust at her feet. She shoved the last child, one of the twins, to safety and dove in after them, shielding them with her body. Jace and Hawk's Talon were now in the rocks on the opposite side. This was not a white man's fight. Huddling and waiting, this was a Comanche fight. "Up!" Jace yelled to his warrior. "Divide them!" They did not retreat. They attacked. They began to climb, using separate paths, disappearing into the jumble of boulders. They were fast, silent, and they knew the terrain. The fight was no longer a turkey shoot. It was a hunt. Above them, Little Wolf opened fire from his position on the high ridge, his shots precise, forcing the ambushers to keep their heads down. The gunmen, hired for a simple massacre, were now caught between two fires. Jace moved like a shadow, climbing, sliding, his rifle speaking in short, sharp bursts. He picked a target, fired, and moved again before the man could return fire. He was a warrior in his element. Colonel Hargrove, positioned on a high ledge, cursed, his face red. "Find him! Find that Indian, kill him!" But down in the canyon, one man was not looking for Jace. Silas Grady, his new suit torn, his shoulder already bleeding from a shot by Little Wolf, saw his plan turning to chaos. He was not a soldier. He was a thief. He saw Elena huddled in the rocks, guarding the children, the prize. He began to climb down, slipping from ledge to ledge, using the noise of the main battle as cover. He reached the canyon floor, his pistol in his hand. He sprinted across the open ground. Elena saw him. Her eyes went wide. No! He was on them. He grabbed the smallest girl, Maria, by the arm, yanking her out of the hollow. The child screamed, a thin, terrified sound. "Got one!" Silas roared, laughing, pulling the child against his chest as a shield. "Come on, wife, the rest of 'em." Elena emerged from the rocks, her face a mask of pure, primal fury. She was not the scared woman from the courthouse. She was not the beaten wife. She was an animal, protecting her young. She launched herself at him, clawing, kicking, biting. "Let her go." She caught him by surprise, her small body wiry and strong. She slammed into him, and he stumbled, enraged. He struck her, a vicious backhand blow with his free hand. She fell, her head hitting the rocks, and lay still for a second. Nearby, Hawk's Talon, who had been providing cover fire, cried out as a bullet from above struck his chest. He staggered, his rifle slipping from his grasp, clattering onto the rocks 10 feet from Elena. Silas laughed, leveling his pistol at the children still hidden in the hollow. "Now, the rest of you." He never finished. Elena, her lips split and bleeding, lunged for the fallen rifle. It was heavy, far heavier than she expected. She raised it, her hands shaking, her eyes locked on Silas. She had never fired a gun in her life. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The recoil slammed the rifle butt into her shoulder, throwing her back. Silas screamed. It was a sound of rage and agony. The bullet had taken him high in the shoulder, the same one Little Wolf had grazed, tearing through the muscle. He dropped the little girl, who scrambled back to the hollow. Silas turned, his face a mask of demonic hate. He raised his pistol, his arm shaking, and aimed it directly at Elena. You bitch! I will kill you!" Elena. Jace had seen it. He had been climbing down, drawn by the child's scream. He was too far away to shoot. He was not too far to run. He launched himself from a 10-foot ledge, hitting the ground and rolling, coming up in a full sprint. Silas fired. Jace dove, his body covering Elena's, just as the pistol flashed. He felt a white-hot poker slam into his side, a fiery, searing pain that took his breath away. He grunted, the impact throwing him onto her. He did not stop. The warrior in him ignored the pain. He pushed off the ground, his body low, and slammed into Silas Grady. The impact was brutal. They both went down, rolling in the dirt, a tangle of limbs, rage, and blood. Jace's knife was in his hand. Silas had his pistol. They were fighting on the edge of the path, a sheer 50-foot drop to the canyon floor below. Above them, the battle had turned. Little Wolf had eliminated 2 of the gunmen. The remaining 3, seeing their escape cut off, threw down their rifles. Colonel Hargrove saw it all. He saw Silas, his best weapon, locked in a death struggle. He saw his men surrendering. The plan was lost. He turned to run, to get to his horse. A figure appeared on the ledge above him. Little Wolf. The Comanche warrior simply stood there, his rifle aimed at Hargrove's chest. Hargrove stopped. He looked at the long, dark barrel. He looked at the cold eyes. Slowly, he raised his hands. At the canyon edge, the fight was primal. Jace's side was on fire, the blood pouring hot over his hip. His vision was starting to tunnel, but his grip was iron. He had one hand on Silas's pistol hand, pushing it away as the man tried to fire again. Silas was screaming, a mad, incoherent string of curses. He knew he was beaten. He knew he was going to hang. "If I die, Indian," he snarled, his face inches from Jace's. "You die with me." With a final, desperate burst of strength, Silas freed his arm, not to shoot, but to grab Jace's shirt. He tried to roll, to pull them both over the edge. Jace felt his balance go. The world tilted, the gravel of the cliff edge sliding under his boots. But Silas, in his madness, had miscalculated. His own wounded shoulder gave out. As he lunged, his footing slipped. His grip on Jace was torn free. For one long, terrible second, Silas Grady hung in the air, his eyes wide with a final, stark terror. Then he was gone. His scream was cut short by a sickening, final impact on the rocks below. Jace lay on the gravel, panting, his hand pressed to his side. The world went gray. He heard Elena screaming his name. The ambush was over. He saw her face swim into view, her beautiful, terrified face, streaked with dirt and her own blood. "Jace!" she cried, her hands fluttering over him, trying to find the wound. She found it, her hands instantly covered in his blood. "No, no, no!" Jace tried to smile. His vision was fading. "It is just a scratch," he whispered. The world was tilting. He collapsed, his head falling back, his eyes closing. "No!" Elena screamed. She grabbed his face, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold him. "No, Jace, do not! Don't you die!" She was sobbing, her tears washing trails of clean skin through the blood and dirt on her face. She pressed her forehead to his, a desperate, intimate contact. "Do not die," she whispered, her voice broken. "You cannot die. I have not told you. I have not told you that I love you." He heard her. Through the gray fog, her voice was a lifeline. He fought his way back, forcing his eyes to open. He saw her, a blurry, beautiful angel of mercy. He tried to lift his hand, but it was too heavy. He managed a weak, bloody smile. "I know," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. He saw her confusion. You tell me every day just by staying." His eyes closed again. He heard her cry out. He felt hands lifting him, strong hands, Hawk's Talon, shot in the chest but still standing, and Little Wolf. They were making a stretcher from rifles and blankets. The last thing he felt before the darkness took him was her hand. She grabbed his, her small, strong fingers locking with his. A desperate, unyielding grip that refused to let him go. He was carried out of the canyon, not as a solitary warrior, but as a man who was, finally, being held on to. For 2 weeks, Jace Red Hawk was an invalid. The bullet from Silas's pistol had torn through the muscle and flesh of his side, missing his vitals by less than an inch. It was a deep, ragged wound that bled and burned. He spent those weeks on his cot, drifting in and out of a fever, the world reduced to the 4 log walls of his cabin. But the cabin was no longer a silent, empty space. It was a place of noise and light. He would wake, not to the sound of the high desert wind, but to the sound of children. He heard the twins, Mateo and Lucas, arguing in whispers over a carved wooden horse. He heard the oldest girl, Isabel, her voice low and serious, telling them to be quiet, that Jace was sleeping. He heard the smallest, Maria, humming a tuneless, happy song to herself by the hearth. And always, he was aware of Elena. She was his nurse, his guardian. She was no longer the deferent, silent employee. She was a woman in charge. She moved with a soft, quiet authority. She woke him to change the bandage, her hands gentle but firm, her touch sending a jolt through him that had nothing to do with pain. The clean, herbal scent of her skin as she leaned close was a better medicine than the whiskey he was not allowed to have. She would bring him broth, her spoon lifting to his mouth, her eyes fixed on his, demanding that he eat. "You must," she would say, her voice low. "You must get strong." He, who had never needed anyone, was completely, utterly dependent on her, and he found, to his profound shock, that he did not hate it. The cabin, his fortress of solitude, had been transformed. His rifles were still racked on the wall, but now a string of drying herbs hung beneath them. His maps and mining contracts were stacked neatly on his desk. But beside them sat a small, lopsided clay bowl Maria had made from mud by the spring. The floor was clean. The hearth was swept. But there was a constant, comfortable clutter of a family. Small shoes by the door. A doll made of yarn on a chair. The entire space smelled of corn tortillas, sage, and soap. It smelled, he realized, like a house. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the ambush, Alistair Reed, his lawyer, rode up from Santa Fe. Jace was sitting in his chair by the fire, his side wrapped tightly, the pain a dull, constant throb. Elena served the lawyer coffee, and the children watched him, silent and curious, from the corner. "The news is good, Jace," Reed said, accepting the cup from Elena with a grateful nod. "Colonel Hargrove has been formally indicted, by a grand jury." Jace nodded. "On what charge?" "All of them," Reed said, a grim smile on his face. "Attempted murder, conspiracy, aiding and abetting a known slaver. That was for his connection to the man Miguel de Leon identified. And, most importantly, land fraud. Your testimony, and the proof of his armed ambush, was the final piece. He will not see the outside of a prison for 20 years. Maybe longer." The news settled over Jace. It was a victory, a solid, heavy thing. He had not used a knife. He had used the law, and the law had won. "And," Reed continued, his voice softening, "I brought this for you. Elena." He pulled a thick sheaf of papers from his satchel. "The court, in light of the criminal investigation and Silas Grady's confession, has issued its final ruling. Your marriage to him is voided, annulled on the grounds of criminal action and fraud." Elena's hand went to her mouth. She stood very still. "And this," Reed said, tapping the top page, "is the legal declaration. You are, in the eyes of the law, the sole and legal guardian of all 4 children, Isabel, Mateo, Lucas, and Maria. Their names are listed here. They are yours. Completely. No one can ever try to take them from you again." Jace watched as Elena took the papers. She held them as if they were a holy thing. She did not weep. She looked at the paper, then at Jace, her eyes shining with a light so bright it almost hurt him to see. She had her armor. It was not pride. It was paper. It was the law. The news of Hargrove's arrest and Silas's death spread through the territory faster than a prairie fire. In Dust Creek, the men in the Buckhorn Saloon spoke in lower voices. Jace Red Hawk was no longer just the rich Indian. He was the man who had faced down Colonel Hargrove, the man who had been untouchable for a decade. He was the man who had used the white man's court and won. The fear they had felt for him, the fear of the savage, was replaced by a new, more potent respect, the respect for power. Life on the mesa settled into a new rhythm, defined by healing and growth. As Jace's body mended, his world expanded. The children, no longer living under the shadow of starvation, blossomed. Isabel, the oldest, at 11, was a serious, quiet child, her eyes holding the old memories, but the fear was gone. She attached herself to the horses. Jace, as soon as he could walk, took her to the stable. He showed her how to groom them, how to speak to them, and how to read their moods. He put her on the back of his most gentle mare. She was a natural, her small body moving with the horse, her hands light. She was not just a survivor, she was a vaquero, like her father. The twins, Mateo and Lucas, were 8 years old and pure, unrefined energy. They were no longer the silent, huddled figures from the hovel. They were boys. They followed Jace everywhere, a pair of small, dark-haired shadows. He set them to tasks, mucking the stable, hauling water. He carved them 2 small, perfect bows. He took them to the edge of the mesa and taught them to shoot, Comanche style. He taught them how to read the tracks of a rabbit, the flight of a hawk. They were his students, his sons, in all but name. And Maria, the youngest, at 4 years old, her memories of the hovel were already fading, replaced by this new, bright world. She was the queen of the cabin. She called it her sky house, and the name stuck. She ran barefoot on the porch, her black hair flying, her laughter echoing off the canyon walls. She would bring Jace wildflowers, her small hands full of blue and yellow, and demand he put them in water. She was the light. But the world below had not changed completely. One day, Elena took the wagon into Dust Creek for flour and salt. Jace was strong enough to ride, and he went with her, his pistol on his hip. The town, which had once been a wall of hostile faces, was now divided. Mrs. Abernathy, the hotel owner who had fired Elena, saw her coming and crossed the dusty street, her nose in the air, pretending not to see her. A group of ranchers' wives, clustered by the general store, stopped talking, their whispers following Elena like small, poisoned darts. A mixed family. The Indian woman, the Mexican, the brats. The old prejudices were still there, like bedrock under the dust. But the owner of the saloon, a man Jace had never spoken to, stepped onto the boardwalk. He touched the brim of his hat. "Mr. Red Hawk, ma'am." It was a gesture of profound respect. The woman who ran the boarding house came out and gave Elena a fierce, brief hug, pressing a small bag of dried apples into her hand. The town was split, but it was a start. Jace, too, felt the split in his own life. He was no longer just the hermit on the cliff. One week, he rode to the Comanche camp, the place his people were held. He brought 3 deer, flour, and coffee. Little Wolf, his arm in a sling but his eyes sharp, greeted him as a brother. Hawk's talon, shot through the chest but saved by a medicine man and his own stubbornness, was sitting up, his wound healing. Jace was no longer the outcast who had taken the white man's money. He was the warrior who had won a war. He sat with the elders. He did not talk of the old ways. He talked of the news. He spoke of his lawyer. He spoke of water rights, of land registries. He told them he would use his money, his paper power, to secure their lands, to fight for their spring. He was using the enemy's weapons to protect his tribe. The following week, he was back in Santa Fe. He wore his black broadcloth suit. He met with the railroad men. They were not the same men who had backed Hargrove. They were new, polite, and deeply cautious. They saw the man who had toppled a land baron. They did not try to bully him. They did not threaten. They negotiated. They looked at his maps. And when he was done, the railroad line was rerouted. It would not touch his land. It would not touch his people's sacred spring. He had balanced his two worlds. But the center of that balance, the pin that held it all together, was Elena. She was the heart of the Sky House. She was the mother. She was the lover. She was the bridge. She learned. She asked Jace for Comanche words. He taught her. Tua, water. Pia, mother. Numa, horse. She taught him agua, madre, caballo. She taught the children English, so they could read the papers from the judge. She taught them Spanish, so they could remember her heritage. The love between them was not a thing of fire and storms. It was a thing of daily, quiet acts. It was the way she would put her hand on his shoulder as she passed his chair. It was the way he watched her, his eyes following her as she moved through the cabin, a quiet, deep satisfaction on his face. He, who had been alone, was now the center of a family. One cold night, the first chill of winter in the air, the family was gathered. A fire roared in the hearth. The one Elena had scrubbed clean, the one Jace had built. The children were clean from their bath, wearing small shirts Elena had sewn from new cloth. They were full of hot stew. Jace sat on a low stool, mending a bridle, the leather and the silver pieces gleaming in the firelight. Elena sat on the other side, darning a hole in one of the twins' socks. The children were gathered on a large bear pelt between them. "A story," Mateo demanded, his voice sleepy. "Mama, a story." "No," Lucas argued. "Jace, a story from you, a Comanche story." Jace looked up, a small, rare smile touching his lips. He put the bridle down. "A story," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I will tell you about the Nomani, the sacred horse." He told them the legend, his voice hypnotic. He told them how the Great Spirit had a herd of horses in the sky, and how one day, one of them, a stallion made of the wind, had seen the Comanche people, the Numa, and had come down. He came from a magical spring, the water bubbling up, and out stepped the first horse. A gift. He was a gift, Jace said, so that our people could be free, so they could run faster than the wind. The children were silent, their eyes wide. "Now you, Mama," Maria said, clapping her small hands. "Tell the one about the crying lady." "Ah, La Llorona," Elena said, smiling. She looked at Jace, a secret, shared understanding in her eyes. "You want the scary one?" "Yes," the twins shouted. "All right," she said, her voice becoming soft, like a storyteller's. "There was once a woman, a sad woman. She had lost her children, and she would walk by the river, weeping, crying, 'Hey, Miss Hijos, where are my children?' And everyone was afraid of her." Isabel, the oldest, shivered, pulling the blanket closer. "But one day," Elena continued, and her story began to change, her voice lifting. "She was not weeping. She was walking, and she was strong. And she met a warrior from the mountain." Jace stopped his work, listening. "The warrior was strong," Elena said, her eyes on the fire. "And he was not afraid of her. He asked her, 'Why do you weep?' She said, 'I have lost my children. A bad man took them, and I am lost.' And the warrior said." She paused, and her gaze met Jace's across the fire. He said, "You are not lost, and we will find them. They are not gone. They are just hidden. We will fight the bad man. We will fight him with the law, and we will fight him with guns. And we will win." "And did they?" Maria whispered, her eyes huge. "Yes," Elena said, her voice full and strong. "They fought the bad man, and he fell off a cliff, and he was gone forever. And the warrior took the woman, and he took her 4 children, and he brought them to his house, a house in the sky. And she was not the crying woman anymore. She was just the mother, and they were safe." The cabin was silent. The twins were asleep. Isabel's eyes were closing. Maria was curled in a small ball, smiling. Jace looked at Elena. She had taken her past, her terror, her folklore, and she had rewritten it. She had given it a new ending. Their ending. The storms were over. The fight was done. Hargrove was in jail, his land broken up. Silas was a ghost at the bottom of a canyon. The law, which had been their enemy, was now their shield. 2 cultures, Comanche and Mexican, once crushed by the same forces, had come together. Later that night, after the children were carried to their beds, Jace and Elena stood on the porch. The night was vast. The sky so clear the stars looked like holes punched in black velvet. It was the same view Jace had looked at for years, a view of profound, terrible loneliness. He looked at it now, but it was different. He could hear, through the cabin wall, the sound of 4 children breathing. He felt the solid, warm presence of Elena beside him, her shoulder just brushing his. The wind was still cold. The world was still wild, but the silence was gone. The emptiness was filled. A year passed. The snows of winter came, deep and purifying, isolating the mesa in a world of white silence. But inside the cabin, there was no silence. There was the constant, thrumming life of a family. Spring returned, and with it, the world was reborn. The cabin on the cliff was no longer a hermit's fortress. It was a home. Elena had made curtains from soft yellow cotton, which billowed in the warm breeze. The front door, once a splintered wreck, was repaired and painted a deep, welcoming blue. The porch, which Jace had rebuilt with his own hands, was wide and long, and a child's toy was always on it. The ranch around it had grown. The single, rebuilt stable was now joined by a second, larger one. The corrals were vast, holding Jace's growing herd of fine horses. And down in the valley, by the spring that Hargrove had coveted, a small cluster of bunkhouses had been built. Jace was not just a hermit anymore. He was the head of a thriving ranch, a center of commerce. He had not forgotten. He had used his wealth, the silver he had once hoarded, as a weapon, as a shield. He had bought the land around his mesa, the whole valley. He called it the Red Hawk Sanctuary. It was a place for the children no one wanted. He had sent word to the Comanche camps, to the Mexican missions. He brought in the orphans, the half-breeds, the children of war and starvation. He built a small schoolhouse. He hired a teacher. He gave them a home in the bunkhouses. And he, along with Isabel, taught them. He taught them to ride, to survive, to read the land. And Elena taught them to read the books. It was a place where no child would ever be valued at $100. It was a place where they were priceless. One afternoon, in the late summer, the air was warm and smelled of dust and mesquite. Jace stood with Elena under the shade of a large, gnarled tree at the edge of the cliff. They were watching the children below. Their 4 children, mixed with a dozen others from the sanctuary, were racing horses in the valley, their laughter carrying on the wind, thin and clear. Jace had been silent for a long time. Elena watched him, a small, knowing smile on her face. He was nervous. The great warrior, the man who had faced down gunmen and lawyers, was terrified. "Elena," he said, his voice rough. He did not look at her. He kept his gaze on the children. "Yes, Jace." He reached into his pocket. His hand, large and scarred, was trembling slightly. He pulled out, not a ring, but a necklace. It was a simple leather thong, but hanging from it was a piece of hammered silver, shaped like a hawk's feather, and tied beside it was a single, perfect, small eagle feather. It was old. "This was my mother's," he said, his voice low. "Her mother gave it to her. It is a blessing, for the family, for the one who holds the family together." He finally turned to look at her. His black eyes were stripped of all their defenses. They were open, vulnerable, and full of a love that was deeper than any canyon. "I am not a good man with words," he said. "I do not know the white man's way of doing this, but in the way of my people, this is how a man asks a woman to be his wife. This is how he asks her to make their families one." He held the necklace out to her, his hand suspended in the still, warm air. Elena's eyes filled with tears. They were not the tears of fear or of sorrow. They were tears of a joy so profound it was almost painful. She smiled, a radiant, brilliant smile that transformed her face. She did not take the necklace, not yet. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her own simple dress. Her fingers fumbled for a moment, and she pulled out a small, tarnished object. It was a thin silver ring, her wedding band, the one Silas had given her. She had kept it, hidden it, as a reminder, a poison. She looked at it in her palm. "This was my past," she whispered. "My prison." With a sudden, quick motion, she turned and threw the ring. It flashed once in the sun, a tiny speck of light, and vanished over the edge of the cliff, falling into the vast, deep silence of the canyon below. "And this," she said, her voice full and strong, "is my refusal of that past." She turned back to Jace, her face wet with tears, her smile bright as the sun. She stepped forward. She did not take the necklace. She simply bowed her head, her black hair falling forward. "Yes," she whispered. His hands, still trembling, came up. He lifted the necklace over her head, his fingers brushing the warm skin of her neck. He settled the silver feather against her collarbone. It lay there, a promise, a claim. He cupped her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "Elena," he whispered. Just her name. It was all the words he needed. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, hungry near miss in the storm. It was not the chaste, grateful touch of a survivor. It was a kiss of arrival. It was deep, and it was long, and it was built on every shared trial. It was a kiss of the law, and the blood, and the bullets. It was the taste of home, of safety, of a future that was not just survived, but chosen, when he finally, gently, pulled away. They were both breathless. The children planned the wedding. It was, Isabel declared, a Wild West wedding. It was held on the porch of the Sky House, under the open sky. There were no flowers from the shop. There were bouquets of yellow rabbit brush and purple sage, gathered by the twins. There were no ribbons. There were strands of painted leather and bright blue jay feathers, hung from the rafters by the children from the sanctuary. It was a strange and perfect gathering. Little Wolf and Hawk's Talon were there, standing as Jace's guards of honor. The old Comanche medicine man who had healed them both came up from the camp. He lit a small, clean fire of sage and cedar, the smoke rising in a thin, pure column into the blue sky. He chanted, his voice the sound of the ancient land. The old woman who ran the boarding house in Dust Creek, Mrs. de Leon, came. She brought her son, Miguel. They stood with Elena, as her family. Even the saloon keeper came, his hat in his hands, bringing a small barrel of good whiskey as a gift. Jace wore his finest buckskin, decorated with simple beadwork. Elena wore a simple white cotton dress, a gift from Mrs. de Leon, and around her neck, gleaming against her skin, was the silver hawk feather. The Comanche elder spoke of the sky and the earth. He spoke of the eagle and the hawk. Then he spoke in English, his words for the mixed crowd. "A man alone is a stone," he said. "A woman alone is a leaf. Together you are a tree. You have roots. You give shade. You are home." He blessed them, his hands dark with age, in the smoke of the sage. When it was over, there was no polite applause. The children cheered. The twins let out a war whoop Jace had taught them. Jace turned to his wife. He did not kiss her. He just smiled. The horses were waiting. Jace swung up onto his stallion. He reached down and swept Maria up, placing her in front of him on the saddle. Elena mounted the mare Isabel had trained for her. The twins were already on their ponies. Isabel sat tall on her own horse, her face serious, but her eyes dancing. "Where are we going?" Elena asked, laughing. "We ride," Jace said. He looked at his family, his wife, his children. "We ride free." He kicked his stallion, and the horse leaped forward. Elena was beside him. The twins raced ahead, their shouts echoing. Isabel rode behind, her back straight, her gaze watchful. The entire family, Comanche, Mexican, and mixed blood, a patchwork of survivors, rode off the mesa. They galloped out onto the wide, open prairie, a small, dark group of figures against a vast, blue sky, chasing the wind. That night, the children were asleep, exhausted from the celebration. The ranch was quiet. Jace and Elena sat on the porch, on their porch, wrapped in a single, thick blanket. The night was cold, the stars sharp and close. "The ranch," Elena said, her voice sleepy, her head resting on his shoulder. "It is so much work." "It is good work," Jace said. "Next season, I will hire more men, men from the camp, men from your town. They will be partners, not just hands. They will have a share, a fair one." "And the children," she said, thinking of the schoolhouse. "They will learn." "They will learn," Jace agreed, his voice a low rumble. "They will learn to read. They will learn to shoot. They will learn to speak English and Spanish and Comanche. They will learn that they are not half of anything. They are whole. They are of the new world. They will not be ashamed of their blood." He was silent for a long time, the words settling in the vast quiet. The lesson was there, unspoken. That justice was not a gift. It was a thing to be taken, to be fought for, with laws and with guns, with courage and with community. That the freedom of the West was not just for the men who conquered it, but for the people who had the strength to build it, to choose what was right, and to pay the cost. Jace looked out at the valley, the same valley he had stared at for years in his profound solitude. It was dark, but he knew every line of it. He could hear through the open window the soft, mingled breathing of his children. He felt the solid, warm weight of his wife against his side. The cold, empty silence that had defined his life was gone. It had been filled with laughter, with arguments in 3 languages, with the smell of cooking, with life. He was no longer just Jace Redhawk, the millionaire young Comanche, the hermit on the cliff. He was a husband. He was a father. He was the pillar of a small, strange, and powerful family, the anchor of a community. He was a symbol of a new West, a West where a Comanche warrior, a Mexican woman, and 4 children of mixed blood could look out at the wilderness, at the vast, free sky, and finally, truly, call it home. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from. So please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And if you can, please support us further by hitting that hype button, so this story can be heard by even more people.